Our Haunted Planet. John A. Keel. Introduction. In September 1953, I spent right hours inside the Great Pyramid in Egypt producing a radio program which was aired throughout Europe over the American Forces Network, AFN, the following month. Egypt so impressed me, and archaeology so fascinated me, that I returned to Cairo the next year and lived there for several months, wading through the musty libraries and museums, prowling the desert, and visiting the ancient tombs. During a trek to Aswan and the Upper Nile, I saw my first flying saucer, a metallic-looking disc, with a rotating outer rim, which hovered for several minutes above the Aswan Dam in broad daylight. I had written and produced a radio documentary, Things in the Sky, in 1952, and my earlier researches into unidentified flying objects had already convinced me that such things not only existed, but that they had been present in our skies since the dawn of man. Eventually my travels took me to Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, and 1,000 places in between. I walked among the ancient ruins and puzzled over man's illustrious but forgotten past. In India I wandered alone into the Himalayas and crossed the border of Tibet, which has since been sealed by the Chinese. As I traveled, I interviewed archaeologists, historians, and assorted experts and spent endless hours in remote libraries poring over rare old books. I was puzzled at first to discover that none of the leading authorities seemed to agree on anything. Indeed, a large part of the scientific literature is devoted to the theorization and incredibly vicious attacks on the theories of other theorists. Most perplexing of all was the fact that some of the literature about the ruins I had visited smacked of pure fiction, because the authors had not visited the sites but labored instead to couple fictitious theories with dubious facts. This led, of course, to conclusions that bordered on the imbecilic. An offshoot of this process is, understandably enough, an enormous quantity of crank literature created by unqualified researchers who attempted to interpret the scientific material in their own ways. In many areas of the less popular sciences, the crank material outweighs the scientific because few if any scientists have tackled those subjects. So 98% of all the available literature on Atlantis, flying saucers, Tibet, and prehistoric ruins falls into the crank category. The task of sorting all this out and developing a valid synthesis is a formidable one which I have undertaken with great trepidation. In his book, In the Name of Science, Martin Gardner defines the characteristics of the common crank or pseudo-scientist. He lists the 4 chief attributes as being: the crank considers himself a genius, even a towering genius who is years ahead of his time. He considers his colleagues and fellow researchers ignorant blockheads, largely because they fail to recognize his genius. He assaults his opponents by impugnation, questioning their honesty, intelligence, and motives. They respond in kind, naturally, and so great storms are whipped up in the trivial teacups of the scientific and pseudo-scientific journals. Controversy is the lifeblood of crankyism. The pseudo-scientist is paranoid and feels he is the victim of a vast conspiracy designed to suppress his brilliant work. In many instances these imagined conspiracies become a vital part of the subject itself, as for example, the endless literature discussing how the U.S. Air Force has been keeping the truth about flying saucers from the public. The crank delights in focusing his attacks on the greatest scientists and the best established theories. He goes after big game. He is wiser than Einstein, knows more about astronomy than Fred Hoyle, and is better informed about the moon than Neil Armstrong. The crank also invents his own terminology, a Jabberwocky understood only by him and his closest allies. So, we find the literature filled with confusing and complicated terms which are merely displays of pseudo-erudition, or what psychiatrists call neologisms. Over the years I have met the leaders of many peculiar cults and pseudo-scientific factions of belief. With very few exceptions, they have all lived up to the above criteria. Most were friendly and cooperative with me until they realized that I did not share their beliefs in Atlantis or visitors from Andromeda. Then they turned on me with wrathful vengeance and launched such campaigns of unfounded slander that I could only be amazed and amused. I have now been accused of being everything from a communist con man to a secret agent for the Central Intelligence Agency, from a religious fanatic, I'm a lifelong agnostic, to a pawn of the devil. Typographical errors, over which I have no control, in my many articles and books have been lovingly dissected by these groups and prompted countless letters and essays reviewing their sinister implications. After 25 years as a writer and reporter dedicated to collecting the facts as objectively and as honestly as possible, my integrity has been attacked from all angles. For these reasons, this book is written in a style which discusses known facts with the popular and unpopular beliefs they have inspired. I am not supporting any of these beliefs, I am merely discussing them. It may be that the great civilizations of Atlantis and Lemuria once actually flourished on this planet. In this book I am only weighing the evidence pro and con. It may be that little green men from Mars really are visiting housewives in Nebraska. I am only reporting the claims of the housewives, not trying to prove that Martians are really dropping in. The believers in Atlantis will undoubtedly hate me. The believers in Martians already despise me. Parts of this book are so obviously tongue-in-cheek that it shouldn't be necessary to mention it. Yet I know from bitter experience that some of my humorous comments will be taken seriously and will prompt new venom. I am not attacking any specific individuals or cults. I am attacking man's abysmal ignorance and his impassioned effort to hide that ignorance from himself. I have seen a large part of this world and its mysteries. Wonder and curiosity have always been an integral part of my life. I am only trying to share that wonder with the reader. This book is based upon countless interviews, endless correspondence, many in-depth personal investigations, and hundreds of books covering everything from alchemy to zoology. Wherever possible, I have tried to include key source references for the benefit of those readers who might be interested in pursuing some of these matters further. It has been impossible, however, to list all my sources. Some of the books used in my research were privately published and are quite rare. Although unidentified flying objects are mentioned frequently in these pages, the UFO controversy is not the main theme. Some of the major UFO cases discussed are drawn from reports which appeared originally in England's Flying Saucer Review, the only truly scientific publication devoted to the subject. I do not pretend to know any answers. After a lifetime of travel and study, I am still learning the questions. This is a journey into man's past and the curious manifestations which have always surrounded them, and which have directed the human race upwards from the caves to the moon itself. It is a journey into a jungle of myth, legend, and belief, and hopefully, it is another small step towards the larger truth that man has always sought but never really found. John A. Keel. Part 1. Chapter 1. You can't get there from here. While hairy, beetle-browed cavemen were laboring to invent fire and the wheel, there already existed on this planet a highly developed civilization of intelligent beings. They built massive cities of stone, many of which are still standing. They methodically constructed giant mountains of earth all over this planet for some purpose which still escapes us. They scattered peculiar artifacts of stone and metal across every continent, and they sailed every ocean, mapping the entire globe systematically. Then they vanished. Cavemen inherited the earth. They regarded the ancient cities as sacred places. As the centuries ticked off, they became conscious of other life forms around them. Life forms that seemed to possess the power of invisibility, of life and death itself. They invented names for these forms. They worshipped them. They recorded the manifestations of that invisible world in myths and legends handed down from generation to generation. Eventually they perfected sciences based upon their observations of those manifestations. In time those sciences developed new myths. The original owners of the earth, the builders of those great cities, were forgotten. But as men spread across the face of the planet, the traces of those lost elders were rediscovered. Man's newfangled sciences couldn't fit such traces into their new concepts, however, so the evidence was ignored. As a result, the earth has two histories, the history taught in our colleges and schools, and the real but ignored history of a very ancient people and of strange forces which have often supervised human events. 10,000 years ago that unknown civilization carefully mapped the entire surface of the globe. Their maps were copied and recopied and passed along from one age to the next. Finally, copies of them were rediscovered by Captain Arlington H. Mallory in of all places, the Library of Congress. Known as the Pinriyas maps, they were originally found among the relics in the former imperial palace of the Sultan of Constantinople in 1929. Eventually they ended up in the archives in Washington, D.C. At first glance these maps, which are dated AD 1513, appear to be nothing more than a hopelessly garbled view of the ancient world. No one paid much attention to them until Captain Mallory came along. Working with the U.S. Hydrographic Office and the Weston Observatory of Boston, he developed a grid system which suddenly brought the maps into focus. The modern Mercator grid system was not invented until 1559, so the ancient surveyors had to develop a method of their own. Once Mallory had unscrambled that method, he could hardly believe the results. These maps were incredibly detailed and as accurate as the latest charts. Antarctica, for example, was not discovered until Captain Cook reached it in 1773, and it was not fully explored until the 1950s. But the frozen continent is laid out with almost pinpoint accuracy on the Pinriyas maps, including mountain ranges that were not even known to us until 1952. Even more astonishing, these maps outline glaciers and land areas which are known to have existed in the Ice Age, before the last great shift of the Earth's crust an estimated 10,000 years ago. This fact led Mallory to conclude that the original on which the Pinriyas maps were apparently based had to have been drawn before the Ice Age. Professor Charles Hapgood, a science historian, heard of Mallory's walk and turned the maps into a class study project at Keene State College. His students painstakingly compared each detail with modern charts and found that the ancient maps were never more than 5 degrees off, and those errors were probably due to land movements that occurred after the originals were drawn. Many of the details of the early maps correlated precisely with modern surveys. The results of Hapgood's studies, together with full-color reproductions of the maps, were published in a book titled Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. Modern scientists can't seem to agree on the age of mankind. Each year produces a new bit of bone and new controversy. Some claim man might be 500,000 years old. Others offer more conservative estimates ranging between 30 to 70,000 years. But all seem to share the notion that our ancestors were embarrassingly primitive 10,000 years ago. They certainly were not developed enough to sail and chart the Earth. It would have been impossible for anyone to contrive the maps in 1929, the year they were found in Constantinople. It would have been even more impossible for someone to hoax them in 1513. And it is downright ridiculous to think that someone could have surveyed the Earth before the Ice Age. Modern scientists have a very scientific method for coping with such humiliating discoveries. They put them in the basements of their museums and forget them. The museums are filled with such erratics, as they are called. A cube of metal, carefully machined, notched, and rounded on one side, was found in the center of a block of coal in Austria in 1885. It's still in a museum in Salzburg and no one has ever come up with an explanation for it. Basing their conclusions on the age of the coal bed, various experts have estimated it to be 300,000 years old. That makes it quite a bit younger than the piece of gold thread that workmen found embedded in 8 feet of rock at a quarry in Rutherford Mills, England. The London Times announced the discovery on June 22, 1844, and the experts mumbled that it had to be 60 million years old. Who could have dropped a gold thread in England 60 million years ago? Or who could have manufactured that iron and nickel cube 300,000 years back? Maybe these things were the handiwork of the same people who made the strange pieces of very ancient pottery which have been found in rock quarries and coal mines around the world, along with steel nails, perfect glass lenses, and even, believe it or not, bones of prehistoric animals with bullets in them. Giant chains have been found embedded in great rocks in both North and South America. Not merely embedded but actually passing through the rocks. They seem to predate the arrival of the Europeans by thousands of years. Electric batteries have been found in ancient Egyptian tombs. A huge slab of perfect green glass weighing many tons was found in a cave in Israel a few years ago. It ranks as the largest piece of glass ever cast and is very ancient. Who made it? How? and why are still unsolved mysteries. Science tells us one thing: these artifacts put the light to all the scientific theories. Take man's earliest records, the cave paintings. Scientists assert that the great saurians were extinct long before man arrived on the scene. Yet cave paintings have been found depicting dinosaurs. Other cliff carvings in the southwest show men hurling weapons at gigantic creatures that look like elephants or mammoths. Captain Mallory created a stir when he first revealed his work with the Piri-Reis maps on a broadcast from Georgetown University in 1956. He dared to suggest that the maps may have been the product of an aerial survey. Professor Hapgood was more cautious, however, and merely implied they were the work of some lost seafaring culture. The aerial survey hypothesis would have necessarily been dependent upon a highly advanced technological society. Not only would flying machines have been required, but photography would also be needed for such a survey. Did the elders have cameras, too? A mere 47,000 years ago somebody carved an intriguing picture on the side of the Hunan Mountains in China. A picture of cylinders in the sky with strange beings standing on them. Russian and Chinese archaeologists could date it. But they couldn't explain it, nor could they explain the drawing they found carved in a cliff at Fergana in Central Asia in 1961. A Reuters dispatch described it as resembling a man wearing an airtight helmet with some kind of mechanical contraption on his back. It has been dated at 7000 BC. Other peculiar cave and cliff carvings have been found in South America, Japan, and the Sahara Desert. Some of these pictures show giants with round heads towering over ordinary hunters. Others depict circular objects with odd creatures coming out of them. These drawings were apparent attempts to record highly unusual and significant events, but today they are open to all kinds of interpretation and speculation. Scattered throughout France there are many ancient caverns heavily decorated with carvings and paintings dating back 10 to 30,000 years. More than 2,000 animals are depicted, including 610 horses, 510 bison, 205 mammoths, and 176 ibex, according to a study published by H. Breuil in 1952. Alongside this impressive menagerie there are scores of other designs which are far more mysterious. They show oval and disc-shaped objects, some apparently standing on tripod legs with ladders extending down from them. Archaeologists can't account for them, but they look uneasily like the modern descriptions of flying saucers. The leading French authority, Aimé Michel, goes so far as to suggest that that is exactly what they are. Ancient records in China describe flying saucers and mysterious lights in the sky. They were usually regarded as dragons, and the early Chinese noted that these things flew regular routes year after year, century after century. Other early manuscripts preserved in India mention vimanas, aerial cars, as if they were commonplace. 5,000 years ago a sage named Maharishi Bharadwaj wrote a thorough description of these vimanas, telling how they could move in all directions silently, cover vast distances, and even become invisible. They were supposedly propelled by tunes and rhythms, perhaps a poetic way of describing the humming and whirring of intricate and little understood machinery. In appearance they resembled the flying cones which have been frequently described in the reports of modem UFO witnesses around the globe. Although this sort of evidence is superabundant, it has never been systematically studied by trained scholars. Instead, this material has fallen into the hands of assorted cultists and students of fringe pseudoscience. It has been used to advance belief in everything from lost Atlantis to extraterrestrial visitants from some distant planet. To subscribe to any one of these multitudinous beliefs is to exclude all other possibilities. We should consider every possibility, avoid belief, and accept only the hard facts. Two key facts are already clear. 1. There have always been strange objects in the skies above this planet. They were seen by early man and have been seen constantly ever since, as the Bible and other available records still firmly attest. 2. Somebody mapped the Earth before the Ice Age. We have no way of knowing who they were or how they did it. If the Piri-Reis maps were the product of an aerial survey, then perhaps there was an advanced civilization somewhere in the Americas or the Pacific, removed from the random clusters of primitive men. but occasionally the advanced culture dropped in on the cavemen or at least flew overhead. Thus, two cultures may have existed simultaneously. One highly advanced and purposely aloof from the other, the animal-like cave dwellers. It was inevitable that the two cultures should occasionally cross and that the higher group should affect the lower in many ways. At some point in early history, the higher culture was either destroyed by a monumental catastrophe or withdrew in some fashion, leaving hardly a trace behind. Our entire record of that superculture comes from the observations of primitive man. Our only evidence is the flimsy overlapping that took place, the residue of the effect of the superculture upon the subculture. Primitive man was profoundly influenced by the superculture and guided by it. There are even indications that members of the superculture actually appeared before primitive man and took over as kings and god-kings to direct his early development. Such appearances helped to generate many of man's first religious beliefs. Some 2,500,000 people believe in the Book of Mormon, the Mormon Bible, which is purportedly a record of life in North America thousands of years ago. As with all such records from all cultures and all religions, there are frequent descriptions of events in which some unknown benevolent group supplied man with direct help in an hour of need. For example, here is how a compass was introduced, presumably, to those long-forgotten North Americans. And it came to pass that as my father arose in the morning and went forth to the tent door, to his great astonishment he beheld upon the ground a round ball of curious workmanship, and it was of fine brass. And within the ball were two spindles, and the one pointed the way whither we should go into the wilderness. 1 Nephi 16:10. One of the most popular theories bandied about in cultist circles is that man was seated on this planet by some interplanetary group and that group has kindly, but remotely, observed and guided our progress ever since. If this were true, they have been doing a lousy job in recent centuries. We need a lot more help than they have been giving us. In H.G. Wells' prophetic Things to Come there is a vision of a world ravaged by war and divided into fierce tribes ruled by warlords. A handful of surviving scientists and thinkers band together and begin the task of restoring civilization by flying over the planet. They call their organization Wings Over the World, WOW. Much of the UFO evidence suggests that a real WOW has always existed. Maybe one of their members handed a caveman the first flaming brand and the first wheel, just as some unknown party allegedly deposited the first compass outside that Mormon tent. A friend from WOW could have handed the original Tree-TS map to some ancient Egyptian. After him it may have passed from the library at Alexandria to the palace in Constantinople. The key to the grid system was lost, so the map became useless. However, it is known that Christopher Columbus did have some strange maps when he set out for his shortcut to India. It is easy to speculate and even easier to leap to mind-blowing conclusions. We must try instead to assemble the many fragments of tantalizing evidence and attempt to construct the whole. To do this, we must first recognize some very unpleasant facts. We must admit just how stupid we really are. In recent months several different scientists attached to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, have issued humble public statements admitting that our space program has produced data which invalidates many of the most coveted conclusions and beliefs of our learned astronomers. Ideas which have been accepted as fact for many years have suddenly been proved completely false. The more we find out about the moon, the less we know about it. Space probes to Mars and Venus have tossed innumerable astronomical theories into a cocked hat. Recent radar probes to the planet Mercury discovered that planet is actually rotating slowly on its axis, even though millions of school children have been taught for generations that Mercury does not rotate. Leading astronomers are now arguing over the status of Jupiter. Some now suspect that it isn't a planet at all but is really a cold star. For the past 2 centuries astronomers have been peering through telescopes, counting stars, and making mathematical calculations to account for the motions and fuckerings they have observed. They have published and taught their learned conclusions as the gospel. Now we know that they have been wrong in many key areas. Before the end of this century all the textbooks will have to be scrapped. All of the old ideas will be discarded. We used to think of the universe as nothing more than abundant fields of stars arranged in galaxies. Dr. Frank Drake, chairman of Cornell University's astronomy department, said recently. But we underestimated the variety and quantity of matter in space by a factor of about 1 trillion. Which means that we were about as wrong as we could be. In the early 1960s, deep-dished radio telescopes discovered a maze of radio signals pouring in from outer space. At first there were wild speculations that we had made contact with some supernovation in some other galaxy. But further study discounted this fascinating notion. Instead, it was found that interstellar space is filled with invisible objects which don't emit light rays but which do give off powerful radio waves. These things have been dubbed quasars and pulsars. They constitute one rather trivial aspect of a broad and complex phenomenon. Our haunted planet has always been bathed in mysterious electromagnetic propagation and radio waves, some of them intelligent signals of unknown origin. We have been aware of these signals ever since the invention of the radio receiver, but we still can't account for them. All of this will be discussed in depth in another chapter. Just as those funny flying eye saucers seem to be an environmental mystery which has always existed on this planet, it also seems that the Earth's atmosphere has always been charged with unidentified radio signals, some of which seem to radiate from the planet itself, as if the Earth were beaming signals into space in response to the signals being received. Of course, the cultists contend that WoW has established secret transmitters in underground caverns. Even gravity is a mystery. Newton discovered the hard way that if you sit under an apple tree, you are apt to get hit on the head by a falling apple. But we still don't know why. Recent experiments indicate that gravity is really a slowly pulsing wave pouring across space, beating about once per hour. The source of this wave and its true nature are a puzzle. We thought we knew something about IC until our astronauts went into space and fumbled around in weightlessness. They found that even friction disappears in space. R. Buckminster Fuller, the great thinker and designer, has said, "Everything you've learned in school as obvious becomes less and less obvious as you begin to study the universe." For example, there are no solids in the universe. There's not even a suggestion of a solid. There are no absolute continuums. There are no surfaces. There are no straight lines. Everything is up for grabs. We don't know anything about the universe or outer space. We have in all likelihood constructed a totally false history of our own race. And most humiliating of all, although we have lived on this planet for at least 40,000 years, we really don't know much about it. Worse still, we haven't even explored it. Vast sections of this planet encompassing hundreds of thousands of square miles have never been surveyed. There are enormous regions that still have not been visited by a single scientifically trained man. Seasoned travelers are wearily familiar with the problem of locating accurate maps. In many countries in Africa, Asia, and South America, detailed maps are simply unobtainable because no surveys have ever been made. Those maps which are available often have the rivers and mountains in the wrong places. Here in the United States, precisely detailed maps of many areas just don't exist. There are blank spots in Maine and even in New Jersey. The average road map doled out by service stations includes only the major highways and the larger towns. Unincorporated villages, and they number in the thousands, can't be found on any map anywhere. The regional maps distributed by the Geological Survey in Washington are often based upon surveys made in 1880 or 1920, so many of them are virtually useless. New highways are being built so rapidly that the average road map is 2 to 5 years behind. Travelers to inland Brazil find themselves trying to cope with maps based on sketches drawn by missionaries 100 years ago. Visitors to the Himalaya mountains have to deal with maps drawn by amateur cartographers and guesswork. Vast sections of the Earth's oceans have not been adequately charted. There are countless islands everywhere that have never been visited, named, or mapped. If WoW actually exists, they could occupy a large island in the Pacific or Antarctica and nobody would ever be the wiser. We have, of course, flown over a great part of the Earth. Back in the 1930s, Charles Lindbergh flew over Brazil and reported seeing an enormous stone wall deep in the jungle. A wall that stretched for miles. No explorer has ever penetrated to that wall over land. We still don't know anything about it. Other flyers in other parts of the world have reported similar oddities, and most of them remain unexplored mysteries. In 1970, the United Nations issued a report which stated that 4/5 of the Earth's surface was inadequately surveyed and charted, and that tremendous areas remain unexplored altogether. The cartographers who drew up the original Piri-Reis maps probably knew more about our planet than we do. Despite all these facts, most of us like to pretend that our planet is fully explored and that all of its many mysteries have been adequately solved. We believe our history books. In fact, many millions of people still cling to the thoroughly discredited religious belief that mankind is only 4,000 years old. Science labors to ignore the mounting evidence that we may not be the only intelligent life form on this planet. Yet historians have always carefully recorded the events which indicate that a para-human race does exist alongside us. Millions of people have encountered them, and thousands of books have been written about those encounters. Now that we are zooming headlong into the age of Aquarius, it is time for us to take a new look at the world around us, time for us to study those despicable erratics of archaeology and history, time for us to think about the unthinkable. Our much-touted technology has led us down the road to ruin, poisoned our environment, and given us the implements for destroying the Earth itself. If there was a great superculture thousands of years ago, perhaps it followed the same tragic course. Perhaps even the abominable snowmen of the Himalayas and their North American counterparts, the Sasquatch of Canada, will inherit the Earth, and 10,000 years from now their descendants will be studying a frayed copy of an old road map and speculating about us. Naturally, there will be scientists among them who will sneer at the whole thing, and they will get back to the business of trying to split the atom. Chapter 2. The Continent That Vanished. Every 2 or 3 years some adventurous scientist or peripatetic deep-sea diver discovers lost Atlantis. He usually announces MS find during the summer silly season when news is slow, and the papers are filled with yarns about the Loch Ness Monster and bathing beauty contests. Atlantis has now been located in the Mediterranean, many times, west of the Azores, south of the Azores, in the Caribbean, off the west coast of South America, off the east coast of South America, in the North Pacific, in the South Pacific, the coast of Florida, and even in the Indian Ocean. Recently the ruins of an ancient temple of unknown origin were discovered in the blue waters off the Bahamas. The newspapers soberly revealed that Atlantis had been found at last. A year or so later a mysterious stone pillar was spotted by divers deep in the ocean off the coast of Peru. Atlantis rose again. This game has been going on for a very long time. Researchers wading through 50-year-old newspapers have found them sprinkled with wondrous tales of Atlantean finds. Professors and PhDs frequently joined the clamor, bidding for publicity, and the often sizable foundation grants that follow such publicity, keeping alive one of the great fantasies of human history. It isn't even a myth or legend, there isn't enough evidence of any kind to give Atlantis such stature. Nevertheless, Atlantis has become an important part of our folklore. Even the famous prophet Edgar Cayce discussed the lost continent with the spirit world and passed along the prediction that it would rise again in the stormy Atlantic in 1965 to 1969. While the reality of Atlantis can be viewed with considerable skepticism, the persistence of the belief in it provides some interesting facts about the weird mechanisms employed by the Earth's phantom inhabitants to generate myths and camouflage their real existence. Atlantis is no more real than visitors from Mars. Yet there are millions of people who have believed wholeheartedly in both. The members of WoW have carefully sowed the seeds of such myths in their wake and have worked across the generations to nurture them. First, how did the story of Atlantis begin? It was launched by a single man named Plato, 427 to 347 BC. In his 2 dialogues Timaeus and Critias he offers a description of Atlantis and its demise 9,000 years earlier. His source, he states, is a man named Critias, who had heard the story from his great-grandfather Dropides, who had heard it from a sage named Solon, who had heard it from an Egyptian priest. So the whole foundation of the Atlantis fantasy is based upon what a 90-year-old man told a 10-year-old boy. Those are the ages given by Plato, about a tale spun by Solon years before. Rather like having your great-grandfather tell you the plot of a novel that someone else described to him after having heard it from someone else in a far-off land. And that someone else hadn't read the novel but had only heard about it, since the novel was 9,000 years old. Incidentally, the final pages of Plato's discourse are missing, so even his record of this hearsay is incomplete. Scholars have devoted their lives to pondering Plato and searching for archaeological evidence to support the existence of Atlantis. Visit any library and you will find shelves of books on the subject. New pro-Atlantis volumes appear each year. A small, indefatigable cult of Atlantean believers has existed for a century or more, pouncing upon each new archaeological discovery as proof of Atlantis. Ruins throughout Central and South America have been credited to the Atlantis culture. Everything from Stonehenge in England to the Great Pyramid in Egypt to the monasteries in the Himalayas has been accepted by the believers as further evidence of Atlantis. In Chapter 1 the premise was stated that mankind could be an offshoot of some earlier superculture. The Atlantophiles have recognized this partially and think of Atlantis as that superculture. The psychic world has supported this contention for years by passing along endless messages about the past glories of Atlantis through mediums, Ouija boards, and the like. Many of these messages have served as the basis for some of the peculiar books that have appeared. Surprisingly, some of the data in this torrent of gibberish can be authenticated historically, but a pattern is hard to establish. There are people around the world who claim to have actually met the Atlanteans themselves. These percipients, witnesses, describe stately men and women dressed in colorful robes and headdresses, who appear suddenly like ghosts or apparitions. People who have never given Atlantis any thought at all are suddenly confronted by these entities. Such visits can last for hours according to the percipients. The Atlantean takes great pains to describe the history of Atlantis in detail, and when the witness scurries to a library, he or she finds some of the things mentioned in the literature. Eventually the percipient may write a book or pamphlet himself, combining what he has read with what he has been told by the entity. His work is entered into the literature and quoted again and again in new books by others. This same phenomenon occurs constantly in religion, spiritualism, and the UFO field. In the latter, the entities claim to represent some other planet and they pass along convincing, to the percipient, descriptions of life on other worlds. Like the Atlantean entities, the UFO pilots share the disturbing ability to appear and disappear in thin air. The tall, bearded Atlanteans with their high cheekbones and oriental eyes are undoubtedly close brethren of the picturesque spacemen who, incidentally, are most often described the same way. In occult lore, these entities have been described for centuries and are called elemental. The phenomenon take many forms and undoubtedly inspired the massive folklore on fairies and leprechauns, vampires and demons, and the multitude of ghouls, goblins, and banshees who have always occupied our haunted planet. They appear to have the ability to assume any shape or disguise. Some, if not all, seem to be the product of some complicated hallucinatory process which is able to feed false images into the minds of the percipients. Thus, a group of people in a room can sometimes come up with contradictory descriptions of an apparition. Some of the people might not see it at all. There are, of course, all kinds of psychological factors which could explain some of these hallucinations and apparitions, too. But it is quite remarkable that some of the messages passed along by our elusive Atlanteans are identical to messages passed along to unrelated witnesses who have chatted with spacemen from Ganymede, a satellite of Jupiter. The same mechanism, be it psychic or psychological, is clearly at work in all these cases. The phenomenon utilizes many other frames of reference. An apparition might pose as an ancient Greek philosopher or as Abraham Lincoln or a deceased pope. There are cases of all these. The folklore of all cultures also takes into account apparitions which pose as exact duplicates of living persons. In Germany, such entities have long been known as doppelgangers. The manifestations have also led to the creation of many minor cults, such as the Believers in Lemuria, which is supposed to be another lost continent, and Mu. Here again, we find that a large part of the literature is based upon the alleged experiences of those who have encountered Lemurians. In the Middle Ages, many people insisted they had visited the underground palaces of the fairies, and volumes were written about the secret commonwealth of the little people. In modern times, the Diro, detrimental robots, myth has blown up around the stories of people who claim they have been taken to the secret caverns occupied by the ancient secret Diro culture. In 1944, Amazing Stories, a science fiction magazine, published Richard Shaver's I Remember Lemuria. Editor Ray Palmer was amazed when he was swamped by thousands of letters from people who swore they had experiences with Diros and Lemurians. They often described things identical to the flying saucer phenomenon, which did not explode on the American scene until 1947. The myth-making machinery of WoW has always been in operation, and the earliest thinkers and scientists recognized it. Strange illusions and purposeful distortions of reality have always haunted the human race. Some cults have defined the culprits as masters of illusion, the Black Mentalists, and the X group. For centuries it was popular to accuse the devil, witches, and warlocks for these bewildering manifestations. Whole religions sprang up around the evidence supplied by the phenomenon. In Sweden, the great mathematician Emanuel Swedenborg, 1688–1772, wrote huge tomes about his experiences with the elementals and offered solemn warnings such as, "When spirits begin to speak with a man, he must be aware that he believe nothing that they say. For nearly everything they say is fabricated by them, and they lie, for if they are permitted to narrate anything, as what heaven is and how things in the heavens are to be understood, they would tell so many lies that a man would be astonished. This they would do with solemn affirmation, wherefore men must beware and not believe them." Sir Walter Scott, 1771–1832, the famous novelist, made a serious study of these matters, and in 1830 he published a series of essays summarizing his conclusions. He noted that when trained psychics encountered fairies and visited their splendid palaces, the illusion vanished. He explained, "The young knights and beautiful ladies showed themselves as wrinkled carles and odious hags. The stately halls were turned into miserable damp caverns. All the delights of the elfin Elysium vanished at once. In a word, their pleasures were showy but totally unsubstantial, their activity unceasing but fruitless and unavailing, and their condemnation appears to have consisted in the necessity of maintaining the appearance of industry or enjoyment, though their toil was fruitless and their pleasures shadowy and unsubstantial. Hence poets have designed them as the crew that never rest." Besides the unceasing and useless bustle in which these spirits seemed to live, they had propensities unfavorable and distressing to mortals. Educated theologians and scholars attached to the Vatican made a sober investigation into the burgeoning fad of spiritualism in the 1850s. This examination led to the issuance of a papal bull which warned Catholics that spiritualism was dangerous and the work of the devil. Despite all these warnings, millions of people were gripped in the hopeful effort to communicate with the spirit world, and the elementals played the game with relish, implanting a whole new lore about life on other worlds or planets. New cults were spawned and dozens of frames of references were established, all based entirely on the seemingly sincere messages of these characters. We were guided from beliefs in fairies and their secret commonwealth to new, more scientific beliefs in interplanetary visitors and their great intergalactic councils. The flying saucer phenomenon generated a whole new set of theories and beliefs as more and more people had encounters with Venusians and Martians in the back hills of Kentucky and the deserts of Arizona. The crew that never rest were up to their old tricks in a new guise. Once the skilled investigator recognizes just how intangible the manifestations really are, he is catapulted into the more esoteric world of philosophy. He struggles with the task of interpreting these unreal events, trying to understand their hidden purposes. This is unfortunately the route to madness. The phenomenon is fond of creating allegorical situations which cannot be interpreted without excessive scholarship. The problem is to sort out the meaningful from the rubbish and to search for the hidden consistencies buried in the mountains of communications from the past and present. The scriptures of all the great religions do contain a number of subtle correlations. Much of this literature deals vaguely with rumors of some great past civilization. Isolated Indian tribes in North and South America have legends and myths very similar to the stories found in the Bible, including tales of a great deluge which destroyed most of mankind thousands of years ago. The Toltec Indians, for example, even had a tradition about Azakua, a very high tower they erected, and according to Ixtacogit, presently their languages were confused, and, not being able to understand each other, they went to different parts of the earth. Atlantean scholars have labored to assemble all this lore as further proof that Atlantis did indeed exist as a real continent, which was destroyed by some great natural catastrophe. However, much of the information passed along by the Atlantean elementals states that Atlantis was an evil place, dominated by a warlike technology very similar to our own, and that the Atlanteans eventually destroyed themselves or were deliberately destroyed by some greater force which took a dim view of their militarism. In flying saucer lore we have tales passed on by the spacemen of a great planet located between Mars and Jupiter and identified variously as Maldek, Clarion, and a dozen other names. The inhabitants of this planet learned to smash the atom and soon succeeded in smashing their entire planet. It was broken into thousands of bits and pieces, and those fragments now constitute the asteroid belt. So, one important thread runs through all this literature. A great civilization once existed prior to the appearance of modern man, and it was either destroyed or destroyed itself. The surviving physical evidence, which will be discussed further on, indicates that such a civilization did exist on this planet and that its inhabitants vanished before, or soon after, man crawled out of his caves. It may be that the elementals are actually a part of the human psyche and that they have been presenting us with some scrambled racial memory of the distant past. Like the Garden of Eden, Atlantis may be nothing more than an allegory designed to give us a clue about our own history. In flying saucer lore there is elaborately detailed literature asserting that Venus was actually the Garden of Eden and that Adam and Eve were Venusians planted here to colonize Earth. Another variation on the Noah's Ark theme. Even more interesting are the contiguous activities of the para-human group, which has remained in constant touch with us throughout history and has greatly influenced our theological and philosophical ideas. They are proven liars and mischief makers, but it is also possible that they have been slyly trying to tell us something about ourselves. In recent years the flying saucer occupants have passed along innumerable warnings about how we have been upsetting the balance of the universe with our atom bombs. They have laced these warnings with blood-curdling tales about Maldek. A controversial UFO report from Mendoza, Argentina, is rather typical of these warnings. On September 1, 1968, Carlos Peccinetti, 26, and Fernando Jose Villegas, 29, were driving home from their job at the Mendoza casino at 3:30 a.m., when their car suddenly stalled. They got out to look under the hood and discovered a huge circular machine hovering nearby. 3 beings in coveralls appeared, they said, and they found they were paralyzed, unable to move. A foreign-sounding voice rang in their heads. It was as though they had put into our ears the tiny earplug speakers used with transistors, Peccinetti said. We have just made 3 journeys around the sun, the voice told them, studying customs and languages of the inhabitants of the system. Mathematics is the universal language. Then a circular screen, similar to a television screen, appeared next to the object, and the 2 men were treated to a series of images. The first was a waterfall in lush country, the second, a mushroom-shaped cloud, the third, the waterfall seen again but without water. After the entities clambered into the machine and flew off, the 2 witnesses were able to move again. Their story contains all the familiar ingredients of thousands of other UFO contact tales. First, their automobile stalled, then they were paralyzed, next they heard a telepathic voice, and finally they were given a simplified message, and the meaning of that message is quite obvious. Police officers, doctors, lawyers, college professors, government officials, and just plain folks by the thousands have shared similar experiences in recent years. The members of WOW have really been engaged in an all-out effort to convince us of some impending disaster. It is not unusual that they should relate their warnings with tales about past civilizations that followed the same woeful path. The Atlantis story seems to acquire another meaning in view of all this. Atlantis could be a part of our future instead of our past. Perhaps we are the Atlanteans. Chapter 3. It's a nice place to visit, but soon after he became president of the United Arab Republic, the late Gamal Abdel Nasser ordered a giant 80-foot statue moved from the desert to a park in Cairo. The statue had been standing for uncounted centuries near the famous Step Pyramid. A battery of engineers and workmen descended on it, equipped with build-fares, tractors, and monstrous cranes. They struggled with the project for weeks, first perplexed, then annoyed, and finally humiliated by the discovery that modern technology simply could not budge the mammoth piece of stone. This raised the even more troublesome question: how had the ancient Egyptians moved the statue into place to begin with? Archaeologists have been arguing for years about the methods employed by the ancient stonemasons. Some quite moronic theories have not only been suggested but have been widely accepted as the answer. These theories are, as usual, taught to school children. The mystery is regarded as solved. Nobody asks questions. There are over 90 pyramids in Egypt alone. There are dozens of others all over the world. The largest of all is located deep in China. Most of the Egyptian pyramids were once used as the burial places for pharaohs, but the Great Pyramid at Giza was never employed for this purpose, and no one has an inkling why it was built. Some of the gigantic stones in these structures and in the Great Temple spotted around Egypt were apparently taken from quarries hundreds of miles away. The popular archaeological theory is that these stones were floated up the Nile on rafts and then moved into place on wooden rollers. Since some of these blocks weigh as much as 5 tons, this means that in order to float them, the Egyptians would have had to build huge rafts capable of displacing over 5 tons of water. Otherwise, they would just sink to the bottom with their load. The Egyptians didn't amount to much when it came to building ships. No evidence of these super rafts has ever turned up. There are other flaws in these theories. We are told that hundreds of thousands of slaves were pressed into pyramid building during certain seasons of each year. This leads us to the problem of logistics. It would take a complex organization to feed these hundreds of thousands daily and administer to their needs. Various modern engineers and experts have applied their slide rules to the problem, and the most liberal estimate of the time required to construct the Great Pyramid is 600 years. Strangely, although the ancient Egyptians left profusive records of everything else, no one has ever turned up even a single piece of papyrus describing the planning or building of these massive monuments. The stones were cut and dressed with such perfection that a piece of paper cannot be inserted between them. Obviously those early stonemasons were superb craftsmen. And obviously there were a lot of them in order to undertake and complete such enormous tasks. When there is a mystery which can't be logically explained by science, cults develop which create explanations of their own. Our Atlantophiles naturally agree that the Egyptians didn't build the pyramids at all. Our UFO buffs claim they were built by the wonderful space people. Morris K. Jessup, an astrophysicist and an early student of urology, reviewed the question and suggested, "Levitation is the only feasible answer. I believe that this lifting machine was a spaceship, probably of vast proportions, that it brought colonists to various parts of the Earth, probably from other terrestrial areas, that it supplied the heavy lift power for erecting great stone works, and that it was suddenly destroyed or taken away." Such a hypothesis would underwrite all of the movements O-pound stone over which archaeologists and engineers have pondered. This presents us with a splendid contradiction. If some super society in the sky had the technology to build a spaceship of vast proportions and fly it all the way to our humble planet, why would they have the need to play around with stone blocks? If they wanted to leave behind evidence of their visit, they did a poor job of it, for we never have figured out the real meaning of these monoliths. Couldn't they have engraved a nice little message for us inside the Great Pyramid, explaining the whole thing in 75 languages? The only carvings found inside the Great Pyramid are a few little scratchings in the roof of the upper chamber which archaeologists regard as stonemason marks. Similar marks have been found in other structures. Maybe they are just the ancient equivalent of Kilroy was here. For centuries the spirit mediums and the percipients who have chatted with ghostly Atlanteans have told us that the Great Pyramid really contains a hidden chamber which is crammed with goodies that will explain everything to us when the proper time comes. Fiat wishing to be left out, many flying saucer contacts have repeated the same promise. An anthropologist named George Hunt Williamson wrote in the early 1950s. The builders of the Great Pyramid buried one of their great spaceships near the structure. It will be revealed, no doubt within a comparatively short time, that there are many secret chambers within the Great Pyramid and that its true entrance lies under the silent object that is like a lion and yet like a man, the Sphinx. It will not remain silent much longer. On February 9, 1960, a fertilizer salesman named Reinhold Schmidt was picked up by a flying saucer and flown to Egypt, according to his pamphlet, Edge of Tomorrow. The friendly space people conducted him on a tour of those hidden chambers where he saw, among other things, the true cross on which Christ had died. He was also shown 32 tablets of a heavy quality paper, rather dark in color. Imagine my surprise when I found the events of the past, present, and future there described in modern-day English, in black ink, and written in beautiful longhand. These records indicated, Schmidt claimed, the end of this present Earth cycle will be 1998. So after the endless discussions of the hidden chambers in the pyramid, we finally had a genuine eyewitness who had been there and seen them. Unless, of course, Schmidt's adventure was just another variation of the classical visits to the underground fairy palaces of yesteryear. Science took over. In 1969 a group of American scientists speeded by Dr. Luis W. Alvarez traveled to Egypt and set up expensive cosmic ray detectors around the Great Pyramid. Their theory was that any cosmic rays penetrating the pyramid and passing through hidden chambers would be recorded as moving slightly faster than ray particles traveling through solid stone. They fiddled with their gadgets for months and did get some very eccentric readings at first. But finally, in the February 6, 1970 issue of Science, Dr. Alvarez glumly announced that no hidden chambers had been detected with his sophisticated apparatus. The cutists all nudged each other and winked knowingly. Obviously it was all a cover-up, part of the great conspiracy to keep the truth from the public. Men have been scratching their heads over the Great Pyramid for at least 4,000 years. It has never really been dated, and it could be considerably older. Whoever built it was so clever that countless efforts to find an entrance met with failure for thousands of years. Finally, in AD 820 the Caliph al-Ma'mun launched a full-scale attack on the structure, expecting to find it filled with treasure. His men chipped away at it, heating the stones with fires and then cooling them suddenly by pouring vinegar over them. Slowly the stones cracked and they worked their way into the pyramid until they came upon a passageway. It was completely empty. They found a larger passageway, now known as the Great Gallery, which leads upwards to two small chambers. The lower chamber's entrance is so small a man must enter on his hands and knees. The upper chamber contains nothing but a crude stone tub which really doesn't resemble the elaborately designed sarcophagi used by the ancient Egyptians to entomb deceased royalty. The total absence of artifacts and hieroglyphics has given archaeologists plenty to speculate over. Some have suggested that the pyramid was used as a kind of grain elevator and that wheat was measured out in that tub. Others have tried to find astronomical significance to it. In the mid-19th century the pseudoscience of pyramidology was born. A writer named John Taylor published a book in which he concluded that the whole purpose of the structure was to preserve ancient Egyptian measurements. He was followed by an astronomer, Charles Piazzi Smith, who extended this notion to include prophecies of the past and future. He measured every inch of the pyramid, inside and out, and every angle. In 1864 Smith published a 600-page book expounding his theories, and it caused an uproar in archaeological circles for years afterwards. A small but devoted cult still exists, still trying to validate his now thoroughly discredited concepts. Most of the literature on Lost Atlantis also discusses Smith and pyramidology. The UFO cults also have their pyramidologists. Just as the pyramids are a cornerstone in human history, they also serve as key evidence to many cults with widely diversified causes. Aside from the few major population centers, ancient Egypt was a mud hut culture. Then as now the masses lived undernourished lives in grinding poverty. Technical skills were rare. Yet somehow they managed to quarry those gigantic stones, transport them, and put them into place with geometric precision. We know that the Egyptians did build the 90-odd pyramids. The village of Meroe on the Upper Nile contains dozens of pyramids alone, plus numerous great temples and tombs which are still standing. But why did they build the Great Pyramid? The plain of jars in Laos has been frequently mentioned in the war dispatches from Indochina. Did you ever wonder how it got its name? The answer is obvious. It is strewn with jars, huge stone jars. Some of them are over 6 feet high. Some are so large they can hold 6 men. There are over 1,000 of these peculiar artifacts scattered around a high plateau surrounded by mountains. They were apparently carved out of limestone and granite boulders, and they've been there forever. No one seems to know who carved them, when and why. Why would anyone bother to spend weeks carving a giant stone jar in such a remote place? Mysterious stonemasons have left the fruits of their labors all over our haunted planet. Many of these fruits make no sense at all. In Costa Rica, giant stone balls have been found deep in the jungles. Some of these are as big as 8 feet in diameter and weigh more than 16 tons. They are amazingly round and smooth. Scores of smaller ones, some only a few inches in diameter, have also been found. Scientists have been unable to come up with an explanation for their purpose, although they are obviously man-made. Similar stones have been found in Mexico and Guatemala. One thing the scientists agree on is that the spheres must have been very important to the communities of people that made them. Science Digest observed in June 1967. Using the tools they had, it must have taken many years to make just one ball, even with many men working on it. Like the jars of Laos, these balls are made of granite and limestone. The United States is covered with strange artifacts and stone ruins of unknown origin. Every state boasts of several mysterious sites. In West Virginia there are the remains of huge circular stone structures apparently predating the Indians. In many states there are rumps which archaeologists have muttered about being of Roman origin. Some of these sites have become minor local tourist attractions. Others are marked only by brief highway signs. A random few, such as Mystery Hill in North Salem, New Hampshire, have attained some celebrity. Mystery Hill features several chambers or tombs topped by a gigantic sacrificial table weighing over 4 tons. It is supported on stone legs and is carefully grooved. In 1969 the New England Antiquities Research Association conducted carbon-14 tests around the site and concluded that it was probably built around 1000 BC. Recent investigations have demonstrated that some of the huge stones on Mystery Hill are carefully aligned with certain stars. Each year the sun sets directly over the winter solstice monolith on the first day of winter, December 21st, when viewed from the center of the site, the sacrificial table. The Delaware Indians have a tradition that a race of giants once inhabited the region east of the Mississippi, living in enormous cities and fortifications. There are innumerable references to giants in other Indian lore and in ancient literature all over the world, including, of course, the famous "there were giants in the earth in those days" biblical statement, Genesis 6:4. South American Indians also have many legends about giants and their special civilization. Most of the tales, no matter what the source, assert that the giants were unfriendly and even hostile to normal men. Bones of giants, who must have been 8 to 12 feet tall, have been found in the mountains of Minnesota and several other places. So it is entirely possible that a race of giants did exist in earlier times, and some of these huge stone constructions may have been their handiwork. Unfortunately, science doesn't believe in giants, so all this evidence has been ignored. There is also considerable evidence that Christopher Columbus was a rather late arrival to the New World. He was probably preceded by the Vikings and maybe even the ancient Phoenicians. Chinese artifacts have been found in Mexico and California, so perhaps even the Chinese beat Chris by several centuries. A knight from the Orkney Islands left a carving in Massachusetts in the 14th century. Near Heavener, Oklahoma, there is a stone 12 feet high, 10 feet wide, and 16 inches thick, covered with ancient Scandinavian runic symbols. It was discovered by Choctaw Indians in 1830, and archaeologists have been arguing about it ever since. Several other 9 stones have been found, the most famous being the Kensington scone, found by a farmer near Kensington, Minnesota, at the turn of the century. 2 more rune stones have been found in Oklahoma in recent years. The last one was discovered by 2 schoolboys near Poteau, Oklahoma, in September of 1967. As usual, the archaeologists are sharply divided over the validity of these discoveries. One group cries hoax, even though it would require an expert archaeologist and linguist to perpetrate such a hoax. Others, such as Frederick Pohl, a noted Norse scholar, seem to think these stones may be authentic. 50 years before Columbus conned Queen Isabella into financing his expedition, someone drew up a rough map of North America. A copy of this map was discovered by Lawrence Whitten, a rare book dealer from New Haven, Connecticut, in 1957. It is now part of the rare document collection in the Beinecke Library of Yale University and is known as the Yale-Vinland map. Scientific investigators have dated it at AD 1440, and as usual, the leading experts have been arguing about it ever since. Some have branded it an out-and-out hoax, while others regarded it as further evidence that the Vikings were frequent visitors to the New World. More substantial evidence has been found in the form of ruins of a Viking longhouse on the Ungava Peninsula in northern Canada. A team from Laval University has dated it between the 11th and 12th centuries. Numerous other ruins and artifacts have been found all over North America. For example, 2 remarkably similar axes, both apparently of medieval European origin, have been discovered in Beardmore, Ontario, and Rocky Nook Point, Massachusetts. Archaeologists from the Smithsonian Institution uncovered a small slab of stone covered with ciphers in 1885 near Bat Creek, Tennessee. They decided it was probably the work of Cherokee Indians, but modern specialists such as Dr. Joseph B. Mahan of the Museum of Arts and Crafts at Columbus, Georgia, have taken a second look at it and disputed the old Indian theory. Dr. Mahan knows Cherokee and he persuaded the Smithsonian to re-examine the Bat Creek stone. "You simply can't ignore evidence," Dr. Mahan stated, "just because it doesn't fit current theory." A similar stone was found by Manfred Metcalf at Fort Benning, Georgia, in 1968. Metcalf was looking for stones to build a barbecue grill in his backyard when he unearthed the stone. It is 9 inches square and covered with triangles, circles, and straight and wavy lines. He passed it on to Dr. Mahan, who thought the markings appeared to be characteristically Mediterranean. Another scientist, Dr. Cyrus H. Gordon, chairman of Mediterranean Studies at Brandeis University, agreed. There were strong similarities between the Metcalf stone and sampled of Minoan writing dating back 3,000 years to the Bronze Age civilization which flourished on the Mediterranean island of Crete from 3000 to 1100 BC. Dr. Gordon became the center of another controversy a few years ago when he announced that a sample of Phoenician writing found on a stone in Brazil was authentic, after other archaeologists had denounced it as a fraud. After all, it was hardly possible that the ancient Phoenicians could have visited Brazil. Or was it? As for the Bat Creek stone, Dr. Gordon thinks it might have been the handiwork of Hebrews from Palestine during the Bronze Age. Both scientists speculate that ancient Semitic tribes from the Middle East may have visited North America thousands of years ago. This, of course, revives memories of the lost tribes of Israel. Could they have somehow found their way to this continent, and become that lost American culture described in the Mormon Bible? Dr. Malian believes that some Indian tribes can be traced back to seafaring Mediterranean peoples. The Yuchi, he points out, are racially and linguistically different from other North American tribes. Their legends state, "We came as the sun came, and we went as the sun went." Dr. Mahan interprets this to mean that the Yucam came from the east, across the Atlantic Ocean, and then moved northwards from Florida to Georgia. Some archaeologists tend to lump rune stones together with the stones bearing Indian petroglyphs. Petroglyphs are designs carved into rocks as path markers, and thousands have been found all over the Americas. Although innumerable isolated Indian tribes were obviously responsible for them, there are many interesting similarities in the symbols used. Some of these same symbols have been found carved on other ancient rocks in other parts of the world, suggesting that this form of writing was universal at one time, even though the races and tribes responsible could not understand each other's languages and in most cases had little or no contact. Archaeologists studiously try to overlook the fact that some of these pictographs can be traced to ancient Mediterranean cultures. But the runic writing is quite distinct from the Indian petroglyphs. The rune stones carry alphabetic symbols, while petroglyphs bear picture writing loosely related to the Egyptian hieroglyphs. The Kensington stone, as translated by Frederick Pohl, describes how 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians established a camp. One group went fishing, and when they returned, they found the 10 who had remained behind red with blood and dead. The year is given as 1362. Indian petroglyphs, on the other hand, were customarily devoted to true information, where to find water, and the like. One Indian pictograph of particular interest is a complex design which has been found throughout North, Central, and South America. It depicts a series of squares inside one another. The hop. Indians call this the Mother Earth symbol. To the Pimas it is the House of Tuhu, to the Cunas in Panama it is the Tree of Life. Anthropologist Harold Sterling Gladwin saw something else in it when he studied this symbol carved on the wall of Casa Grande, Arizona. In his book, Men Out of Asia, he noted that the Mother Earth symbol is identical with the Minoan labyrinth depicted on coins from Knossos, Crete, circa 200 BC. The famous labyrinth was said to have been built by Daedalus to hide the half-man, half-bull Minotaur. Dr. Gladwin and Dr. Clyde Keeler of Milledgeville, Georgia, both seem to think that the Indians' use of the ancient labyrinth symbol is evidence of the influence of the early Minoan culture. In the eerie 1960s, Angelos Galanopoulos, a Greek scientist, proposed still another theory for Atlantis. He suggested that sunken Minoan cities of Crete might have supplied the basis for the Atlantis legends. According to his theory, Plato got his dates wrong. Atlantis may have disappeared only 1,000 or so years before the historian heard the tale, not 9,000 years before. It may have been one of the Greek islands, possibly Thera. Divers and archaeologists working in the waters there in recent years have uncovered all kinds of evidence indicating that the Minoan culture came to a very abrupt end. So abrupt that craftsmen left their tools next to unfinished works and fled. The explanation currently in vogue is that a sudden volcanic eruption destroyed the islands. Dr. Galanopoulos has been partially successful in matching Plato's description of Atlantis with what is now known about Thera. Dr. Bruce C. Heezen, an oceanographer, believes that the eruption occurred around 1400 BC. Needless to say, other scientists and schools loudly dispute this date. We do know that early Crete was the center of an impressive culture, that great cities and temples were built there, and that it was a major naval power. It is not likely, however, that Crete and Thera could have lived up to Plato's description of the super-civilization of Atlantis. Still, we have all the perplexing evidence of the rune stones and other artifacts scattered around this continent. WMCH demonstrate that men from Europe and possibly from Crete and Thera did visit America in pre-Columbian times. It is even possible that groups settled here and built forts and temples, the remnants of which have served to augment the beliefs of dozens of cults and fringe societies. In a learned dissertation on petroglyphs published by the Smithsonian in 1937, Julian H. Stewart frowned on the arguments that attempt to prove that Egyptians, Scythians, Chinese, and a host of other Old World peoples, including the 10 lost tribes of Israel, invaded America in ancient days. He noted that devotees of the subject have written voluminously, argued bitterly, and even fought duels. Now, over 30 years later, the Smithsonian is slowly changing its tune. They have stopped blaming the Indians for all these carved slabs. The Indians have been denying credit all along, of course. When the white men first arrived here in British Columbia, Canada in I-860, the West Coast Indians had already incorporated the carvings in their legends. One Phil Thornburg, a petroglyph expert in Victoria, Canada, said recently. They showed them to white explorers and explained they were left by an ancient civilization and were the hub of creation. Tom Burke points to what appears to be a carving of a Chinese dragon, known in Indian legend as a Sisatl. There does seem to be an oriental background to them, he observes. Being carved in sandstone, it's virtually impossible to say what age they are. I've found some that were buried under more than a foot of topsoil. Now this wasn't the kind of topsoil that would have washed over them. This was formed there, placing the age of the carving around 5 to 7,000 years, which is really ancient for this country. Tom Burke found one petroglyph on Vancouver Island that had a hole worn completely through it by dripping water, proof that it had been there for a very long time. At another site he found a carving which had crumbled when a massive tree grew straight up through it. Petroglyphs, which were definitely the work of Indian tribes, often tell interesting stories about hunts and battles, and in several instances, encounters with the little people and other phantom inhabitants. Some contain solemn warnings that the valley or mountain ahead is the abode of these sinister phantoms. The Cherokee Indians have legends about the strange entities who resided around Chimney Rock, North Carolina. White people have also seen them occasionally. In 1806 the Reverend George Newton reported to the Raleigh Register a very extraordinary vision of thousands of beings in the air. They possessed a glittering appearance resembling the human form and were seen on or about Chimney Road on the 31st of July last. Researcher Angelo Caporero found this testimony by a Mrs. Reeves, one of the alleged witnesses. I looked towards the chimney. I was absolutely amazed, for south of Chimney Rock and floating along the side of the mountain was a huge crowd of white, phantom-like beings. Their clothing, and filmy as it looked, I can only call it clothing, was so brilliant a white it almost hurt my eyes to look at them. Although I felt weak, somehow, it left a solemn and pleasing impression on my mind. Chimney Rock is only one of the countless haunted places on this haunted planet. Chapter 4. Towers of Glass and Theories of Putty. Vitrify is a $10 word meaning to change into glass. Glass is made by heating sand, silica, and / or various oxides of silicon, boron, phosphorus, and other materials, then cooling the result rapidly to prevent crystallization. The process is fairly simple, and men have been manufacturing glass for thousands of years. When the first atomic bomb was exploded in New Mexico in 1945, it not only left a big hole in the ground, but the tremendous heat melted the sand and fused it together in glass-like fragments. These scorched particles were identical to the objects known as tektites. Tektites have been found all over our haunted planet and have baffled science for years. One recent expedition found tektites scattered over an area 6,000 by 4,000 miles from Tasmania to north of the Philippines and from the East Indies to the east coast of Africa. These were analyzed as being approximately 700,000 years old. Like nature, science abhors a vacuum. So most books on mineralogy blandly assert that tektites are of meteoric origin. It is a nice little theory, and everybody seems to believe it. However, a majority of all meteorites are made out of solid iron, and most are vaporized by the intense heat of friction when they enter our atmosphere. Substances capable of melting into glass would, of course, burn up before they hit the surface of the Earth. In 1969 a group of NASA scientists dished up a delicious new version of the meteorite theory. They announced that tektites were from the moon. Eons ago, they speculated, a huge meteor plummeted into the moon, striking with such force that its impact hurled tons of moon dust into space. This lunar material attained escape velocity and passed into an orbit around the Earth, where it gradually was sucked downwards by gravity, entered the Earth's atmosphere, melted, and fell into the Pacific Ocean. So another mystery was solved, unless you happen to have an 8th grade education, a slide rule, and a basic knowledge of the mechanics involved. Then you would find that the impacting meteor would have to be of enormous size and be traveling at fantastic velocity in order to accomplish the first step, casting debris beyond the moon's gravity. Such a meteor would, in all probability, affect the moon in other discernible ways, such as changing its orbit. Next, a long series of spectacular coincidences would be necessary for the debris to enter the proper orbit at the proper time so that it would lapse into a retrograde orbit around the Earth. Finally, since tons of tektites are scattered in paths across the Pacific floor, and since we know that less than 5% of a mass entering the Earth's atmosphere is likely to survive and hit the surface, the quantity of lunar material necessary to produce those tektites must have been larger than the original impacting meteor. Hunks of glass have fallen from the sky, however. In fact, since ancient times all kinds of odd junk has been dropping on us, ranging from stone pillars and metal wheels to huge blocks of ice and vast quantities of real blood and even raw meat. Science conveniently ignores everything but the iron lumps which, they presume, are pieces of old planets drifting around in space. To astronomy's credit, we do know that there are groups of this debris in the Earth's orbit around the Sun, and we can predict annual meteor showers which occur as we pass through this mess. One chunk of glass and metal crashed into a driveway in Cannifton, Ontario in September 1968. Wesley Reed looked at it and saw that it was too hot to handle. After it cooled, he found he had a brownish object weighing about 12 ounces. When it was tested by experts, they found it was made of glass laced with a small quantity of pure zinc. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to be a part of a man-made satellite, which contained very little glass anyway, and it definitely fell out of the sky. Earth's phantom inhabitants are always dumping their garbage on us. Flying saucer enthusiasts have been collecting and analyzing this junk for years and have found pieces of pure aluminium, magnesium, tin, copper, slag, and endless varieties of silicon. Unfortunately for them, none of this aerial debris seems to support their contention that UFOs are spaceships from another planet. Nor has any known meteorite strewn such materials or tektites in its path. The discovery of tektites and vitrified stones among the ancient ruins of Baalbek has inspired another popular ufological myth, that Baalbek once served as a spaceport for rocket ships from another world. A Soviet ethnologist, Professor M. Agarist, proposed the theory in an article in Moscow's Udaratuurnia Gazeta in 1959. He also suggested that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by an atomic bomb. Lot's wife, he asserted, did not turn into a pillar of salt but was actually reduced to a pile of ashes when she ignored a warning not to linger behind Lot's fleeing party. Baalbek is located in Lebanon, east of Beirut and north of Damascus, Syria. In ancient times it was a thriving city filled with great temples dedicated to Baal, the sun god. The pillars and stone slabs, some weighing many tons, still standing are impressive, but no more impressive than the scores of other similar ruins scattered throughout the Middle East. Enormous ruins of this type can be found deep in the heart of inhospitable deserts, raising once again the question of how the ancient peoples managed to quarry, transport, and erect these monuments with crude tools and a minimum of mechanical aids. Yet, quite obviously, they did manage, and managed well. In 1948 an expedition from the University of Chicago unearthed the remnants of an ancient village 30 miles east of Kamuk, Iraq. Dr. Robert J. Braidwood estimated that the village had been settled some 8,000 years ago. Baalbek is, in comparison, a modern city. Professor Agarist's theories were a bombshell to the assorted cults, particularly the flying saucer believers. He regarded the presence of tektites as evidence that atomic-powered rockets had once used the vast stone platforms at Baalbek as launching areas. Apparently he did not know that vitrified ruins are a common phenomenon all over the world. Forts and towers so old that there are no legends to account for them can be found throughout northern Europe and the British Isles, and the walls of many of these are vitrified. At some point in the distant past these structures must have been subjected to tremendous heat, though not necessarily from the blast of some nuclear-powered rocket. Lightning is the explanation most frequently offered by science. But there is no evidence to indicate that lightning bolts vitrify stone or even sand, although we really know very little about lightning and its effects. It would take dozens of lightning bolts all striking the same spot to produce these vitrified monuments. In some parts of the world, such as an area of 18,000 square yards outside of Cusco, Peru, whole hillsides have been vitrified. Theories of volcanic activity and glacial movements have been offered to account for these, but none of these theories really work. There are legends describing how the planet was once bathed in fire. Maybe more than once. So this vitrification could be the product of some nearly forgotten natural catastrophe. On October 8, 1871, a gigantic fireball or meteor roared over the Midwest, causing a rash of disastrous fires in several states, including the famous Chicago fire. Thousands of people were killed in Illinois and Wisconsin, and vast areas were ravaged by flames that night. A similar fiery visitor from space could have caused the vitrifications. Another strange phenomenon could be to blame. From time to time, overpowering waves of heat from an unknown source are concentrated in specific areas. Figueira, Portugal, suffered one of these mysterious blasts of heat for 2 minutes on July 6, 1949. The temperature soared to 158 degrees. Hundreds of people collapsed in the streets, while thousands of chickens and ducks keeled over dead, and the Mondego River dried up suddenly in several places, killing countless fish. We don't understand this phenomenon at all, and it is possible that even more intense heat waves of this type have occurred in the past. The followers of Agorist were not about to accept such mundane explanations for the vitrification of Baalbek, however. A young astronomer, Dr. Carl Sagan, presented a paper before the American Rocket Society on November 15, 1962, in which he repeated Professor Agorist's speculations and urged that ancient myths and legends be re-examined for possible clues to an early visit by an extraterrestrial civilization. Other researchers scoured the ancient records of India and found things such as the Mahabharata, a document dating back more than 3,000 years, which describes a blazing missile that hurtled out of the sky into the midst of an attacking army, producing a radiance of smokeless fire which flattened chariots, ignited forests, boiled rivers, and produced dark clouds of death. All of this sounded uneasily like an atomic attack. In the Masala Parva, another ancient historical account, there is a vivid description of some kind of death-dealing ray which began as a small, bright glow, grew into a shaft of brilliant light, and then consumed its target. This phenomenon was accompanied by violent winds, peals of thunder in cloudless skies, and earth tremors. Terrible Rakshasas, shaped like huge mounds, attacked another Indian army from the sky and fired weapons winged with gold, thunderbolts, and hundreds of fiery wheels. Even in the Bible we are told how the prophet Elijah was saved by balls of fire which wiped out 100 soldiers and their captains, Kings 2:1. That would have been around 96 BC. There are innumerable stories of this type from all cultures indicating that Wow is armed with spectacularly advanced weapons and doesn't hesitate to use them against mortal men. So, one cultist conclusion about the vitrified forts is that they were attacked by flying saucers which focused deadly heat rays on them and their occupants. However, the entire desert between Damascus and Baghdad is littered with blackened cocks. Thousands of square miles seem to be charred, not by the sun but by some long-forgotten holocaust. Did Wow lay waste to all of Mesopotamia? Or did some horrible natural disaster wipe out the great civilization that once thrived there? Chapter 5. Strong Men and Stupid Enterprises. 4,000 years ago Great Britain was populated by a small group of people barely out of the Stone Age. They had a few primitive tools made of bones, and they probably eked out a living with only the greatest difficulty. Anthropologists estimate that there were probably about 300,000 of them. They were undoubtedly divided into warring clans and factions, since factionalism is a natural state of man. Yet somehow, thousands of these people managed to get together to spend many generations quarrying huge stones, some weighing 30 tons, in the Preseli Mountains of Wales and hauling these enormous blocks 240 miles to Salisbury. There they systematically arranged these stones in a circle, following measurements so precise that they were able to construct a mathematically correct astronomical computer. It's called Stonehenge. Like the Great Pyramid, Stonehenge appears to have been a pointless and impossible exercise. Thousands of workers had to be fed, clothed, and housed for generations as they labored on the profitless project. Top-flight administrative talent must have been necessary to plan and organize the work and supervise its execution. Architects had to design the monument with care before the first block of stone was chipped out of the hillside. Above all, we are asked by the archaeologists to believe that these early primitives had the motivation necessary to dedicate themselves to such an awesome task. We are also asked to believe that they pushed and hauled these monstrous stones up and down hills, across rivers, through forests, and soupy bogs on sledges and wooden rollers. Then somehow, they managed to stand the slabs on end, lifted other stones on top of them, and built the whole thing so securely that it would last for 4,000 years. Plainly, the whole thing is quite absurd. In his definitive book, Stonehenge Decoded, astronomer Gerald S. Hawkins catalogues these absurdities and offers the educated estimate that the construction of Stonehenge required at least 1.5 million man-days of physical labor. He calculates that it took 3 centuries to build. That's 10 generations. 10 generations of primitive people who were somehow convinced that it was worthwhile to arrange a pile of giant stones in a circle on an English plain. 4 generations. The work on Salisbury Plain must have absorbed most of the energies, physical, mental, spiritual, and most of the material resources of a whole people, Hawkins observed. There are others, of course, who prefer to believe that the early Britons didn't build Stonehenge at all. To them, it is obviously the work of the Atlanteans or even the wondrous space people. If Stonehenge were the only existing megalithic monument of this type in Britain, Hawkins' work would be more acceptable. Unfortunately, there are several hundred of these stone circles scattered about the British Isles, many of them just as mysterious as Stonehenge. We must therefore assume that all the Stone Age Britons were frantically engaged in monument building for at least 1,000 years. If the scientists have dated Stonehenge correctly, then its construction occurred around the same time that the Minoan culture blossomed on distant Crete. The Great Pyramid had already been built or was in the final stages. So far as we can tell, the Indians had not yet appeared in North and South America. On Lewis, the northernmost island of the Outer Hebrides, many hundreds of miles north of Stonehenge, there is another group of giant standing stones arranged in a circle. Called Callanish, this ring consists of 13 blocks set around a large central stone. It is erected in a desolate, hard-to-reach place, again posing the questions, how and why did the early builders put it there? Since Callanish is somewhat cruder than Stonehenge, Hawkins speculates that perhaps it was built first, and the builders applied what they had learned from that effort to the later construction on the Salisbury Plain. But the two sites are separated by a vast distance and expanses of water. In order for the theory to work, we need evidence that the early Britons were also great travelers and had a society developed enough so that they could travel in large groups. The small, wandering tribes couldn't meet these criteria. Astronomers and scientists have been measuring and studying these sites for centuries, and the general conclusion is that the stones were arranged in such a way that they deliberately aligned with certain stars and phases of the moon to form a crude computer which acted as a calendar. Hawkins fed his own calculations into a modern electronic computer and produced numerous charts and tables demonstrating such correlations. In essence, when a man stands in the center of the Stonehenge circle, specific stars, or the sun or moon, appear directly over specific stones at specific times of the year in a manner which had to be planned by the builders. Hawkins noted, some 240 Stonehenge alignments translated into celestial declinations. For whatever reasons those Stonehenge builders built as they did, their final, completed creation was a marvel. As intricately aligned as an interlocking series of astronomical observing instruments, which indeed it was, and yet architecturally perfectly simple, in function subtle and elaborate, in appearance stark, imposing, awesome, Stonehenge was a thing of surpassing ingenuity of design, variety of usefulness, and grandeur in concept and construction, an eighth wonder of the ancient world. Considering the enormous amount of effort that must have gone into its construction, Stonehenge ranks as the costliest calendar in the world. Earlier investigators tried to explain Stonehenge as the work of the Romans, the Danes, similar constructions stand in Denmark, and the Druids, as esoteric priesthood which entered Britain from France in 500 BC. Stonehenge had been around for at least 1,000 years when the Druids arrived, but nevertheless, Druidism has become closely allied with Stonehenge. Even today, members of the most ancient order of Druids make an annual pilgrimage to the site to perform their rites which they claim date back to the days of Atlantis. Incidentally, Hawkins discovered that a significant cycle occurs every 18.6 years at Stonehenge. He calls it midwinter moonrise, for the moon rises over one particular stone every 18.6 years. Then he points out with some glee a statement by the ancient historian Diodorus, circa 50 BC. The moon as viewed from this island appears to be but a little distance from the earth and to have on it prominences like those of the earth, which are visible to the eye. The account is also given that the god visits the island every 19 years, the period in which the return of the stars to the same place in the heavens is accomplished. What god visited the British Isles every 19 years? Could Stonehenge have been constructed to predict the appearances of some alien being? This would have given those ancient stonemasons a strong religious motive for constructing it. Whoever planned Stonehenge had to have a knowledge of mathematics and astronomy. Did the Stone Age Britons possess such knowledge? Or was the information passed along to them somehow? Were they following orders, just as Moses followed the specifications given to him by Jehovah for the construction of a gold ark, Exodus 25? The gods and demons of all cultures have always had a penchant for ordering men to build huge yet seemingly useless temples, tombs, and artifacts. Soon after Gerald Hawkins published a summary of his findings in Nature, October 26, 1963, he became the center of controversy. Mathematicians, astronomers, and archaeologists who had never been near Stonehenge assaulted his thesis and dissected his semantics. He did leave many unanswered questions largely because they were unanswerable. 20 miles from Stonehenge there is another ancient wonder. The Mammoth Mound at Silbury. This is a man-made mound of earth 130 feet high, covering over 5 acres. Scientists estimate that it was constructed around 1800 BC, which means that while thousands of early Britons were starting work on Stonehenge, other hundreds or thousands were pointlessly hauling baskets of dirt to Silbury to build one of the largest mounds on Earth. In 1848 a group of investigators burrowed a tunnel into it, going from the top to the bottom in hope of finding some clue. All they discovered were some picks made from red deer antlers. Recently these objects were given the carbon-14 test and were found to be from around 800 BC. This was most upsetting to the theorists who believed the mound was at least 1,000 years older than that. At the present time a team of American and British archaeologists are busy digging new holes in the Silbury Mound, searching for new clues. Man-made mounds of unknown origin and purpose number in the thousands all over this haunted planet. In Ireland they are called Sid, or fairy mounds, and are purportedly the homes of the little people. St. Patrick is supposed to have stood on Croagh Patrick, a mound in County Mayo, when he ordered the snakes out of Ireland. Hundreds of these mounds are scattered throughout the United States, where they are popularly called the Indian mounds, even though the Indians have no legends to account for them. Some of the mounds in Ohio, Minnesota, and in the Southwest are skillfully laid out in geometric patterns which can be seen only from the air. When viewed from above, they represent elephants, birds, snakes, and other animals. Whoever laid these things out apparently intended them to be seen from the air. From the ground they appear to be nothing more than symmetrical hills with flat tops. Aerial surveys of South America have revealed elaborate, ridged fields and earthwork, some covering 50,000 acres and some as long as 1,000 miles, in at least 5 scattered locations. The ridged field at Lake Titicaca in the Andes covers 200,000 acres and is spread over 160 miles. These man-made ridges and mounds may have been part of a complex agricultural and irrigation system. Other mounds and ridges of this sort are spread throughout Europe and Asia. Stone chests found in mounds in the Mississippi Valley are identical to chests dug up in mounds in Yorkshire, England. But most of the mounds have yielded little or nothing to patient diggers. Yet the presence of these mounds everywhere is an indication of a worldwide culture in prehistoric times which regarded mound building as an important activity. We do know that mound building persisted as part of the burial rites of ancient peoples. Early historians such as Homer and Herodotus describe these rites. Alexander the Great is supposed to have spent a fortune to erect a huge mound over the grave of his friend Hephaestion. The kinds of ancient Scythia on the Black Sea were buried under mounds. Archaeologists assume that this mound-building practice led eventually to the development of the Egyptian pyramids. The desert sand was a poor mound-making material, so the Egyptians switched to stone blocks. But how did mound building spread to the Americas in the pre-Indian epoch? Flying saucer cults read great significance into the fact that many modern UFO sightings seem to congregate around the old Indian one mounds. Strange lights, bobbing and weaving and blinking in intelligent patterns, periodically cavorted above the mounds of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. Since UFOs have a tendency to appear in the same geographical locations year after year, century after century, it is possible that ancient peoples saw them too and erected the mounds for them. Some flying saucer writers have borrowed a page from Professor Agarist's Baalbek theory and suggested that the flat-topped mounds were intended as UFO airports. If the great mounds were merely monuments to the dead, they were costly ones. Even with modern bulldozers and steam shovels, it would take much time and money to construct a mound 130 feet high and 5 acres square, like the Silbury Mound. It is difficult to visualize tribes of prehistoric people engaging in this activity for months or years. It is even more difficult to think of them planning the mounds so they would present specific symbols when seen from the air. Now, it has been established that while the early Britons were simultaneously erecting Stonehenge and piling dirt for the Silbury Mound, they were also carving giant figures in nearby hillsides. The figure of a great white horse is cut into the summit of a hill in the Berkshire Downs. At Sainabas, a giant caveman is traced upon a hillside. He carries a club, and his male genitalia are prominently displayed. A similar figure, the Long Man at Wilmington, was emasculated by early Christians. There are many others spotted from Australia to Africa to the United States, all obviously meant to serve as landmarks for unknown pilots cruising the virgin skies. The tradition for making these landmarks survived until at least 1500 years ago, for that is the apparent age of the famous nasal lines found in the Peruvian desert. Nobody paid much attention to these lines until the early 1940s. Since then they have become an important facet of Atlantean and flying saucer lore. From ground level, the Nazca lines are merely a jumble of paths made by brushing aside the stones and pebbles of the desert. There is little rain or natural erosion in the area, so the lines have remained intact for at least 700 years and possibly even for 1500, estimates vary. Seen from the air, the clearances form the outlines of spiders, birds, fish, assorted monsters, or unknown animals, and numerous squares and rectangles, some longer than 2 football fields. Dr. Maria Reich, a German astronomer, has lived at Nazca for 20 years, carefully charting all the lines by viewing them atop a high ladder. Daniel Cohen remarked in Science Digest, May 1970. In spite of such devotion to her work, she is regarded by some scientists as a woman obsessed with a theory, rather than a careful scientist. Dr. Reich had produced all sorts of correlations between the lines and the positions of the sun, moon, and stars. She postulates a gigantic desert calendar with which the ancient Peruvians could mark the passing of the years. Her opponents argue that with so many lines and so many astronomical bodies with which to make alignments, it is possible to work up many correlations, but that they are meaningless. The Inca people who created these lines were massacred in the wars which followed Francisco Pizarro's invasion of Peru in the 1500s. The Inca civilization destroyed by Pizarro apparently came along centuries after the lines were laid out. An ancient Inca road slices across the desert, ruthlessly severing the lines. It would seem that the Incas regarded the lines as insignificant. Nevertheless, hundreds of people must have worked for years, if not for generations, in planning these lines and scratching away the topsoil to render them. The Nazca lines remain as another of early man's energetic but seemingly pointless enterprises. On Easter Sunday, 1722, Dutch Admiral Jacob Roggeveen landed on an island in the Pacific some 2,200 miles from the coast of South America. The first things he saw were hundreds of giant statues squatting near the water line, staring out to sea. They were huge, eyeless heads mounted on small stone bodies. Some were as high as 36 feet. Admiral Roggeveen had discovered not Atlantis but Easter Island, a pitifully barren volcanic island with an area of 45 square miles, with almost no trees, and with no wildlife except for hordes of bothersome insects. It was populated by cannibalistic tribes of Polynesian origin who had apparently migrated there centuries before. The current population is 270, but at one time it was considerably larger. Intertribal wars and raids by early slave traders whittled the population down. The Aku statues were quarried from volcanic rock. Some weigh as much as 30 tons. Since wood is practically non-existent on the island, the statues must have been hauled out of the quarries with ropes and sheer muscle power, dragged down to the beaches and raised upright with more muscle power. Many of the monuments were topped with a hat, or pukeo, made out of red talc. Some of these pukeos weighed 5 tons. How the natives raised these 5-ton carvings to the tops of the erected statues is another puzzle. Like the builders of Stonehenge, the Easter Islanders had to accomplish their task with the crudest kind of tools. Each statue must represent months or years of labor. There are over 600 on the island. The statue building came to an abrupt end for some reason. So abrupt that the workers dropped their stone chisels on the spot. Their tools have been found in the quarry, next to 200 unfinished statues, some of which measure 66 feet long. Various expeditions have visited Easter Island and tried to piece together the story of the HV builders, but the surviving natives have only the vaguest legends. During the tribal conflicts of the 18th and 19th centuries, many of the statues were overturned and destroyed rather contemptuously. Remnants of the island's culture were erased by the wars, slavers, a smallpox epidemic, and missionaries who ordered the destruction of pagan artifacts. The latter included ancient wooden tablets covered with an unknown form of writing. Only a few samples of these tablets remain in scattered museums. Scientists who have concluded that the Easter Islanders are Polynesians blithely overlook the fact that megalithic structures are virtually unknown in Polynesia and that the Polynesians never developed a form of writing. One Easter Island legend stresses that wars were waged between a tribe of long-eared people and a tribe of short ears. The short ears won and presumably ate all the long ears. Perhaps the long ears were the Ahu builders. Easter Island is so isolated that the early settlers must have been marooned there, and lacking wood. For boat building, remained out of touch with the rest of the world for centuries, while they developed their own peculiar culture. They did have a complicated religion, and it is possible that the statues were some part of it. The red hats could have some meaning, for even the American Indians have legends and prophecies about gods in red hats. But there are also intriguing legends of red-haired beings in such distant and isolated places as Borneo, and the ancient gods of Europe and Asia were often described as having red or blonde hair. Modern UFO contacts claim that the space people who ride around in flying saucers have long red or blonde hair, too. So it is not surprising that some cultists speculate that members from Laos may have visited Easter Island and that the Ahu statues are tributes to them, each statue symbolizing one appearance of a god. Scores of giant red-haired mummies have been found in a cave 22 miles from Lovelock, Nevada, in the UST 60 years. The first ones, discovered in 1912, were between 6.5 and 7 feet tall. Artifacts found in the same cave have been dated by carbon-14 tests. Apparently, the cave had been occupied as far back as 5,000 years. The local Paiute Indians have legends about these giants, describing them as being cannibalistic. In her book, Life Among the Paiutes, 1882, Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins wrote that the last of the red-haired giants were exterminated by the Paiutes in the 19th century. They would dig large holes in our trails at night, Mrs. Hopkins reported. Our people would fall into these holes. That tribe would even eat their own dead. Yes, they would even come and dig up our dead after they were buried and would carry them off and eat them. Atlantis lore also describes giant red-haired cannibals who behaved almost like traditional vampires. Some authors have speculated that the red-haired giants invaded Easter Island from South America, and the cannibalistic rites of the Easter Islanders were inherited from them. There is now an American military base on Easter Island, and recently the workmen and heavy equipment constructing an airfield were diverted to raise one of the flattened statues. It took a heavy crane to do the job that was once done by hundreds of dedicated natives engaged in another of early man's impressive but pointless enterprises. Easter Island has been a favorite of National Geographic for years, and the cultists have had a field day inventing explanations for the mystery. But there are many other Pacific islands even more remote and very rarely visited which pose far more baffling questions. The city of Metalanum on the southeastern shore of Ponape Island in Micronesia is now in ruins, but it once could have housed 2 million people. No one knows who built it or when. Some of the stone blocks in those ruins weigh 15 tons, and the stone used in the city is not from the island. Gigantic waterways or canals intersect the city, some of them large enough to float a battleship. Who built this enormous place, and how did they move those huge stone blocks across the Pacific to the island? Whatever happened to the 2 million residents? 3,000 miles to the southeast of Ponape Island, on tiny Maiden Island in the Line Island chain, there are the ruins of 40 stone temples whose architecture is identical to that of Metalanum. Basalt roads lead from these ruins straight into the Pacific Ocean. The island is uninhabited and covered with guano, bird droppings. But if we draw an imaginary line southwards from Maiden for 1,200 miles, we arrive at Rarotonga in the Cook Islands. Here another ancient road of basalt blocks rises out of the ocean. Innumerable other hard-to-reach islands scattered throughout the Pacific are dotted with enigmatic ruins, canals, and roadways from some long-lost culture. They all seem to be interrelated, as if they were all once part of some great civilization. It would be prohibitively expensive to organize a proper scientific expedition to visit and study all of these far-flung ruins systematically. Besides, their existence doesn't fit in with any of the current anthropological theories. Suppose some scientists should find that they date back 10,000 years or more and are the remnants of some super-civilization of the past. No matter how substantial the evidence might be, he would be immediately crucified by his colleagues and drummed out of all the scientific societies. Obviously. Metalanum was built by cannibals with stone chisels, and those canals served their religious rites to the water gods. Believers in the lost continents of Mu, Pan, and Lemuria, which may have been one place, noisily embrace these tidbits as evidence that a great landmass did exist in the Pacific at one time and that it was populated with a highly advanced race while the Egyptians, Britons, and Cretans were all fashioning stone axes. One cultist tradition, passed along by talkative elementals and members of WoW, is that Lemuria preceded Atlantis. After Lemuria sank into the Pacific, the Atlantis culture got underway and flourished for 14,000 years before it, too, sank 10,500 years ago. A mystical archaeologist named James Churchward is largely responsible for the modern revival of interest in Mu. In the early part of this century he traveled through Central and South America probing into ancient ruins and trying to decipher stone carvings and petroglyphs. Then he published a series of books which combined scientism and scientism, that is, he applied the scientific method to dubious fragments of evidence, to support his contention that a supercontinent once existed in the Pacific. Law his view, Easter Island served as a kind of factory, and the great stone heads manufactured there were shipped off to other parts of Mu. The poorly investigated ruins of the Pacific Islands and the Great Island Mounds, yes, huge man-made mountains are found on many of these islands, were all a part of that ancient civilization, he said. He leaned on scrambled translations of stone carvings and vague legends of undefined origin. These were mixed in with the flat statements of elementals and strange wise men. Churchward also saw evidence or traces of Mu in the ruins of the Mayan civilization in Central America and the Aztec and Incan cultures further south. He compiled charts which compared the writing of Maya with the hieroglyphs of Egypt, and he constructed the ancient alphabet of Mu. Ultimately, he produced precise maps of Mu and tried to demonstrate how the mysterious ruins found in the United States were linked to that remote continent. Sealists everywhere leaped onto his bandwagon, and an enormous body of Mu literature has developed, but science remains unconvinced. Actually, there is considerable merit in Churchward evidence, even though his conclusions and his bold statements about Mu history can be questioned. A fantastic culture of stone builders and mound builders, predating modern man by centuries or even thousands of years, obviously did exist all over this planet. The only possible explanation for the many Pacific ruins, such as the huge stone arch found on the coral atoll of Tonga Taboo, two upright columns weighing 70 tons each, topped by a crosspiece weighing 25 tons, is that these islands must have somehow been linked together by a land mass in the distant past. The culture of this mysterious land spread throughout the world. Then an unthinkable catastrophe occurred. A catastrophe which altered the face of the whole earth and wiped out everything but the most durable constructions of that doomed race. In effect, the slate was wiped clean. The ancient world was destroyed and a new race slowly emerged. But we are still haunted by racial memories of our planet's past. Every race and every culture has preserved and even guarded memories of that earlier epoch. Unfortunately, modern science has boxed itself in and dedicated itself to proving Darwin's theory of evolution and other theories which supply a rational, but not necessarily valid, explanation of man's origin and past. Chapter 6. A funny thing happened on the way to extinction. Want to discover a lost city and be entered in the annals of archaeology? It's easy, according to James Randi, the famous magician and escape artist who has spent considerable time probing into the ruins of Asia and South America. Just visit an out-of-the-way place and ask the natives for directions to the nearest lost city, Randi explains. There are thousands of these structures in every continent, and only a comparative handful have been recognized by archaeology. Those prehistoric stonemasons were ubiquitous, and they left their works everywhere. A young geologist named Karl Mach found the lost city of Zimbabwe in southern Rhodesia in 1871 simply by asking an ivory trader for directions. Mach's story is filled with high adventure. The trader, a German-American named Adam Renders, rescued him from a tribe of hostile natives and led him to the site of the ancient ruins. Mach decided Zimbabwe was actually the biblical gold center of Ophir, where the fruits of King Solomon's mines were collected. But all he and Renders found were a series of granite structures on top of a steep bill, filled with winding passageways and tunnels. The largest was the elliptical building, roughly 830 feet in circumference and 33 feet high. Nearby were two towers. A cave on a cliff some distance away has proven to have unusual acoustics. When someone speaks in the cave, his voice can be heard in the elliptical building but nowhere else. Doubtless, the native priests put this phenomenon to nefarious use, else Prague de Camp, a reformed science fiction writer, notes. Archaeologists have been arguing about Zimbabwe for 100 years. The ruins have been dated variously from AD 700 to 1500. They have been credited to everyone from the Phoenicians and the Egyptians to the naked Bantu tribesmen. Their workmanship is rather crude when compared with the far more impressive structures of Asia, the Pacific, and South America. Nevertheless, someone will probably never know who went to the trouble of dragging thousands of granite bricks to the top of a hill deep in the African jungle 1200 years age and building an elaborate fortress temple filled with labyrinths and passageways whose only apparent purpose is to drive archaeologists mad. The city of Timbuktu lay little more than a legend until the closing years of the 19th century, when French adventurers crossed 2,000 miles of the Sahara wasteland and found it on the banks of the Niger River in what is now the country of Mali. It was settled in AD 1087 and was once a large, thriving trade center. Today it has a population of about 8,500. The architecture of Timbuktu is not particularly impressive, and the city is most noted for the hundreds of storks who reside there. Since a prominent city Timbuktu could become lost in modern times, it is not surprising that even larger and more impressive cities, such as Angkor Wat, could get lost altogether. Angkor was only a myth until explorers stumbled onto it in Cambodia in 1857. It contains enormous temples and pyramid-like structures apparently related to the mysterious structures of the Pacific Islands. The walls are covered with statues and bas-reliefs, and the origins of the city are lost in a welter of half-remembered legends. Local natives still speak of the great godlike beings who built the place. Hard facts are rare. One story popular soon after Angkor's discovery is that the city was abandoned suddenly, probably around AD 1300, in the same way that the Easter Icelanders threw down their tools in their quarries and fled. At least it is obvious that Angkor was the product of an advanced culture of engineers and stonemasons and that their culture vanished rather suddenly. History demonstrates that men have often built imposing, elaborate cities, flourished in them for hundreds or even thousands of years, then deserted them to live in simple grass huts on their perimeters. Wars and natural calamities often played a part in this pattern, of course. Great cultures have risen and then died out. Men returned to simpler ways of life. It is a natural order of things. 1,000 years from now people may be living in thatched shacks in New Jersey and on Long Island within full view of the decaying towers of Manhattan. They may tell the children about the peculiar ancients who built the towers as part of the strange region which worshipped the great god money. In the Middle East, the little country of Jordan is filled with Roman ruins predating the Christian era. A large Roman theater with a seating capacity of 4,000 can be found near Amman. There are great temples and triumphal arches and countless stone columns lining dead streets paved with large stone blocks. Far to the south of Amman, in the midst of the unfriendly desert, the traveler enters a narrow gorge which leads through the cliffs to an ancient city right out of the Arabian Nights. This is Petra, carved out of the red sandstone cliffs and filled with stately columns and temples. This Arab Shangri-La was constructed around 700 BC and must have housed thousands of people. Food, water, and supplies had to be brought in through the gorge, the only approach from miles away. Thousands of men must have labored for generations, hacking these monuments out of the walls of this hidden valley. Some of the ruins are pre-Roman. There are ancient tombs, and a narrow stone staircase leads to an area on top of a cliff where two 20-foot obelisks are located on the high place, a platform measuring 45 by 20 feet. Perhaps Professor Agarist would regard it as another launching platform for nuclear rockets. The culture that built Petra is lost in legend and archaeological confusion, but in the city's final days it was used as a hideout by desert bandits. For the most part, believers in Mu, Atlantis, and flying saucers have ignored the ruins of the Middle East and Africa, concentrating instead on the lost cities of Central and South America. The fairly recent Mayan, Inca, and Aztec civilizations cannot account for all these ruins. There is evidence that another, possibly far more advanced, culture thrived in the Americas in earlier times. Remnants of that civilization may have been handed down to the Indians who followed. Tiahuanaco, a fabulous stone ruin high in the Andes Mountains, has inspired more curiosity, speculation, and nonsense than any other. It has been the subject of countless books and articles and has been used to support the beliefs of nearly every outlandish cult going. In recent years there have been innumerable flying saucer sightings and appearances of little glowing green men around Lake Titicaca, which is 12,644 feet above sea level. Tiahuanaco is at the southeast end of the lake. Although the ruins cover only about 1/6 of a mile, they feature impressive tumuli, man-made mounds, a 50-foot high pyramid, and a number of stone platforms and underground chambers. The famous Gateway of the Sun is an arch weighing nearly 10 tons. Archaeologists believe that the Tiahuanacans were part of an empire that preceded the Incas by 2,000 years, but they left no written record, and there are no local legends about them. When the Incas Laytet conquered the Lake Titicaca region, they found Tiahuanaco abandoned. While many of Ti's structures in Petra were carved from the sandstone cliffs in place, some of the walls in Tiahuanaco were whittled out of huge blocks weighing as much as 60 tons and then somehow moved into place. Giant statues also stand around the site. One weighing 20 tons has been moved to a museum in La Paz. In their book, The Great Idol of Tiahuanaco, Hans Bellamy and P. Algen offer an interpretation of the symbols found in a huge statue discovered in a Tiahuanacan temple. They claimed the symbols recorded astronomical knowledge of a very advanced order. Eric von Däniken, author of Chariots of the Gods, visited the Andes as his search for evidence that spaceships had visited the Earth in prehistoric times. He described seeing a 20,000-ton stone block near the ruins of the Incan fort of Sacsayhuaman. Däniken explains. It is a single stone block the size of a 4-story house. It has been impeccably dressed in the most craftsmanlike way. It has steps and ramps and is adorned with spirals and holes. The whole monstrous block stands on its head. So the steps run downward from the roof, the holes point in different directions like the indentations of a grenade, strange depressions, shaped rather like chairs, seemed to hang floating in space. Who can imagine that human hands and human endeavor excavated, transported, and dressed this block? What power overturned it? What titanic forces were at work here? And to what end? The fortress of Sacsayhuaman is surrounded by a wall 60 feet high, containing stones weighing as much as 200 tons. 200 tons! Morris K. Jessup, a qualified investigator, viewed the fortress and described these stones. All of them crudely rough quarried and were then ground into their designated niches in the structure by pushing them back and forth in situ, until they fitted so closely, completely, and accurately that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. This is a logical and practical shortcut to effective stone fitting, which we have not qualified in modern engineering. Science writer Joseph Goodavage questioned Jessup's theory in Flying Saucers UFO Reports, number 4. The stones, he pointed out, had to be lifted into the air, placed roughly into their proper positions, and then by some force inconceivable to us, shoved back and forth, grinding down the roughly hewn surfaces until they fitted smoothly and perfectly into their proper niches. To lift, swing into position, then rub the massive weight back and forth, against enormous friction, without loosening its snugly fitting neighbors was no job for simple aborigines or even for an advanced Inca culture. The fact is that Sacsayhuaman was ancient long before the Incas appeared on the scene. To add to the mystery, some of the larger stones found in the Andes ruins were quarried in a valley 200 toises away. Somehow these enormous blocks of stone had to be transported up and down mountains to their final resting place. Those fond archaeological inventions, wooden rollers, and rafts, couldn't have been used. So how did the ancient builders accomplish this task? A possible explanation taken seriously by some scientists, and loudly berated by others, is that these monuments were built in a time when the surface of the earth was actually different from what it is now. A time when the Andes were level with the rest of the land. Hans Schindler Bellamy prowled around Lake Titicaca and claimed that he found traces of marine sediment indicating that the Great Deluge had once engulfed the area. This of course was evidence that the ruins had been built before the deluge and were many thousands of years old. Two Frenchmen, Louis Pauwels, editor of the magazine Planète, and Jacques Bergier, a nuclear physicist, seemed to go along with Bellamy in their book, The Morning of the Magicians. They proposed that the Earth was once inhabited by a giant race which built the mountains and monoliths and maintained a worldwide civilization with key centers in the Andes, New Guinea, Mexico, Abyssinia, and Tibet. They were the true Atlanteans and were destroyed by some great cosmic disaster. The evidence reviewed thus far does indicate that this planet was once occupied by a single great culture or a series of intertwining cultures which possessed secrets of engineering and stone building beyond anything known by the ancient Minoans, Romans, had Britons. They constructed their monuments in isolated places, such as the islands of northern Scotland, the Pacific, and the Andes Mountains, demonstrating an incredible sense of purpose as well as awesome perseverance. Our anthropologists and archaeologists have been struggling to uncover and understand the history of the past 4,000 years. They have steadfastly refused to consider the possibility that mankind may be only the latest race to infest the earth, that other races and other civilizations may have thrived here and died here. One of the increasingly popular themes in science fiction is the notion that an earlier super race built spaceships and sent their members off to visit the stars. Now those space travelers are returning to home base in their flying saucers, and they're looking around in unhappy confusion, asking, where did everybody go? Who are all these pitiful little ants shooting at each other? Alfred Wegener, an obscure German meteorologist, died in 1930 after suffering 15 years of ridicule, slander, and contempt at the hands of his peers and colleagues. He was branded a fool because he believed that the Earth once contained two large land masses which had gradually split up and drifted apart to form the 6 continents. Every schoolboy who has ever studied a map of the globe has reached the same tentative conclusion, for the great land masses do seem to conform like the pieces of a massive jigsaw puzzle. Wegener's evidence was a bit more complicated than that, however. He considered fossils from different continents, climatic changes, and specific geological formations, such as mountains which seemed to display marked similarities on the different continents. But science was not ready to consider the theory of continental drift in 1915. It was easier to denounce Wegener, dissect his ideas with more popular theories, and consign his books to the scrap heap. When Wegener died in 1930, his theory seemed to die with him. In the late 1950s, the Wegener controversy long forgotten, a new crop of scientists began to explore the oceans, and new data were fed into computers. Mountain ranges were discovered under the oceans, laid out in ways which confirmed Wegener's earlier speculations. Almost overnight, the continental drift theory became a new scientific fact. The National Science Foundation has now committed $5.4 million for new tests and studies. Alfred Wegener may soon have the last laugh that 150 to 200 million years ago there were two supercontinents. They broke apart and drifted away from each other slowly. They are still moving slowly, almost imperceptibly, and their movements have been measured by satellite photos and other means. North America is moving away from Europe at the rate of an inch per year. New instruments are able to measure the magnetic fields of rocks on the ocean's bottom. These measurements indicate that the Earth's magnetic field has frequently shifted, the North Pole becoming the South Pole and vice versa. Such magnetic shifts have occurred at least 171 times in the past 70 million years, further proof that the Earth's crust is wriggling about. What all this means is that, about 200 million years ago during the age of the great reptiles, the Paleozoic age, this was an entirely different planet. Perhaps it harbored life forms now unimaginable to us. Then it broke up, and new continents were formed, new climatic changes occurred, the physical environment itself may have changed. These changes could have brought about the sudden or gradual change of the life forms as they altered to adapt to the new conditions. Some of the puzzling erratics discussed in Chapter 1 could have been produced by a form of intelligent life now lost and forgotten. But a lot of other changes can occur in 200 million years. It is doubtful if even the most advanced civilization could produce any quantity of monuments and artifacts which could withstand millions of years of erosion and geological change. The Atlantophiles are not too happy with the continental drift theory because it virtually excludes the possibility that any large landmass could have existed between North America and Europe. It might not rule out Mu or Lemuria, however. Other stubborn cultists are already leaping onto the continental drift bandwagon and claiming one of those two landmasses as their favored lost continent. Our flimsy knowledge of the very ancient past is based entirely upon the discovery and interpretation of fossils found in the various lock layers of the Earth's crust. This inexact science called paleontology is only 200 years old. We haven't dug deeply enough or studied things thoroughly enough to reach reliable conclusions about the distant past. So many of the facts commonly accepted today are only educated guesses. If the Earth has suffered truly cataclysmic changes in the past 200 million years, we must first know of and understand those changes completely before we can accurately assess the meanings of rock formations. It seems unlikely that we will ever be able to develop methods for collecting evidence that will give us conclusive truths about the Earth's past. Astronomers and mineralogists were astounded and upset by the rocks our astronauts scooped up off the surface of the Moon, because they indicated that the Moon was 4 billion years old or even older, and it may be even older than the Earth itself. Some astronomers had been pushing the theory that the Moon was really just a chunk of the Earth that had been scooped out of the Pacific Ocean area and tossed into space somehow. That theory and many others went down the drain when our first space module dropped onto the Sea of Tranquility. Geologists and paleontologists have developed reasonable evidence that the Earth has passed through several glacial periods, or ice ages. These seem to be cyclic, with minor ice ages occurring every 12,000 years or so and with major glacial periods taking place over longer periods. These ice ages suggest a really major catastrophe, a sudden shift of the Earth's entire axis. If you lived on the planet Uranus, the seventh planet from the Sun, you would be exposed to a pseudo-ice age every 21.5 Earth years. Our knowledge of Uranus is admittedly flimsy, and when and if we ever manage to visit it, we may find that many of the currently accepted facts about the planet are erroneous, just as our moon landings disproved many of the previously accepted facts about our own satellite. In any case, the best astronomical information indicates that Uranus has a very wobbly axis and that it flips over about 4 times for each of its circuits around the Sun day. A Uranus year is 84 Earth years. A resident living on a fixed point on Uranus would find himself shifting drastically away from or towards the Sun every 21.5 years. If the planet were closer to the Sun, these shifts could produce dramatic changes of climate. It is possible that the Earth's orbital mechanics include similar fluctuations of the axis over longer periods. Scientists have figured out that there are minor climatic changes on Earth every 170 years due to minor axis shifts. The magnetic polarity of our planet is quite unstable. The magnetic South Pole is not a fixed point but moves steadily in a 200-mile circle. As already noted, the poles reverse themselves every few million years. Studies of the rock levels of the last ice age have produced evidence that major shifts of the Earth's crust or the planet's entire axis occur every 12,000 years or so. Such shifts would change the climate completely. Frigid areas would suddenly be in the tropic zones, water would inundate land areas, and of course, all life would be affected. Seashells and fossils have been found in the heart of the Sahara Desert, indicating that it was once covered with water. In a stimulating article in the Saturday Evening Post of January 16, 1960, zoologist Yvonne T. Sanderson documented the amazing results of one of these planetary inversions. Prehistoric mammoths found preserved in the frozen muck of Siberia had mouthfuls of unswallowed plants, as though they had been quick frozen while munching happily on their feeding grounds. Sanderson pointed out that the only way these animals would have been so splendidly preserved was to have been exposed to an incredible drop in temperature. TMs could have occurred in several ways, he pointed out cautiously. The Earth's crust could have shifted very suddenly, carrying the animals farther north very rapidly, the entire axis could have topped over, or some cloud of frigid gases from space could have suddenly engulfed the entire planet. Whatever the case, the discovery of these animal carcasses is solid evidence that some unexplained calamity took place with fierce suddenness thousands of years ago. Decades earlier, an Austrian mining engineer named Hans Horbiger had developed a fanciful theory to explain the Earth's early history. He envisioned huge spheres of ice crashing into the planet and talked of captive moons, which predate our present moon, entering retrograde orbits, their gravity tearing up our seas and reshaping the Earth's surface. His 800-page Glacial Rosmogenie, published in 1913, enraged the astronomers and scientists of Germany and Austria. The late Willy Ley, the German rocket authority and science writer, summed it up when he said, "To pick flaws in this theory is about as easy and as pleasant as gathering Japanese beetles from an infested flower bed." But Horbiger found a powerful ally, another Austrian named Adolf Hitler. In 1925, Horbiger delivered this ultimatum to the scientific world. "The time has come for you to choose whether to be with us or against us." While Hitler is cleaning up politics, Hans Horbiger will sweep out of the way the bogus sciences. The doctrine of eternal ice will be a sign of the regeneration of the German people. Beware. Come over to our side before it is too late. Powerful backers materialized, and Horbiger set up offices and recruiting campaigns for his doctrine of eternal ice, with Tyler. His scientific critics were soon subjected to horrifying harassment and cringed in terror as we took on all the dimensions and power of a poetical party. Every good Nazi had to declare, "I swear that I believe in the doctrine of the eternal ice." With the disintegration of Nazi Germany, Way also seemed to melt away. But recently Horbiger's concepts were resurrected by Pauwels and Bergier in the dawn of magic. There have been 4 geological epochs, they state flatly, because there have been 4 moons. The earlier epochs were influenced by gravitational changes and factors which produced giant animals and plants, and in a world peopled by monsters there appeared this first man of immense size, bearing also no resemblance to us and possessed of a different kind of intelligence. Cosmic rays became stronger in those days, they tell us, and produced a vulgar mutation. Survivors of this race of giants overlapped into the modern epoch and are mentioned in the folklore of many races, usually being described as evil and violent characters. One of Horbiger's disciples was Hans Bellamy, who sifted myth and legend to find farther proof for the doctrine of eternal ice. It is not unusual that the way believers turned to the Atlantis literature and found in it some of the evidence they sought. The Atlantophiles had also scoured folklore and uncovered innumerable references to earlier global disasters. Although scientists sneer at the use of myths as evidence, it is obvious that all the isolated races of mankind managed to preserve the same kind of stories. Of all the bits and pieces assembled from these ancient tales, the most common is the universal account of a great flood which occurred simultaneously over the entire planet, if the assorted legends have been dated correctly. Many Indian tribes in the Americas have myths about arks and Noah-like personalities who survived the flood. If we take these things at their face value, we can assume that the Earth did experience a phenomenal rising of the waters in fairly recent times, that a large part of the land surfaces were inundated, and that some human beings escaped because they had been warned in advance and had fled to high places or had constructed ships which were sufficiently seaworthy to withstand the torrents. The flood legends form the cornerstone of the Atlantis myth. A colorful politician named Ignatius Donnelly was responsible for the revival of interest in Aoanris in the late 19th century. He collected hundreds of fragments of archaeological erratics and wrote a number of best-selling books. He also managed to find time to serve as a U.S. congressman and state senator and even ran for vice president on the populist ticket in 1901. Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, is still in print and makes some sense, even though it fails to prove the existence of Atlantis. It does prove that other civilizations existed before the present epoch. Donnelly also advocated a theory claiming that a visiting comet had upset the balance of the Earth in earlier times and produced catastrophic effects. Derbyger carried the theory several steps further. Comets have always served as a kind of scientific catch-all. Although we actually know very little about these celestial objects, since we've never managed to catch one, astronomers like to believe that these fireballs are made of ice and that the huge chunks of ice that have crashed out of the sky for centuries were really from the tails of comets. In recent years, many prominent scientists have seriously explained flying saucers as being the debris from comets' tails. During the UFO flap of 1966, the late Senator Robert F. Kennedy sent out form letters stating that one explanation of this phenomenon connects the lights that are seen with the gaseous tails of comets. If a comet ever did strike the Earth, it might make life here rather uncomfortable. Scientists have estimated that if a solid meteorite only a mile in diameter should strike the planet intact, the impact and concussion could destroy a large part or all of life here. There are a number of large meteor craters, all very ancient, which prove that such collisions have taken place. Ancient civilizations could have been destroyed by any one of these potential catastrophes, as well as such things as enormous earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Our planet is really unstable. Mountains are always blowing up. The crust is constantly shifting, generating earthquakes which take a frightening toll in lives and property every year. Rivers overflow and floods occur with appalling regularity. Enigmatic fireballs can sweep down out of the sky suddenly and unexpectedly and burn up whole cities like Chicago. On top of all these hazards, we have the most dangerous factor: man himself. He has made war an economic and political necessity. The ruins of the Middle East and Europe stand as testimony to his ability to destroy whole civilizations by himself without any outside help. Among the traditions of the Hopi Indians is the story of Kuskar, the Third World War epoch, which lay in the east, Atlantis again. They developed flying machines called Pachinotast according to Frank Waters in his book of the Hopi. Some of them made a Pachavada, and with their creative power made it fly through the air. On this, many of the people flew to a big city, attacked it, and returned so fast no one knew where they came from. Soon the people of many cities and countries were making Pachavadas and flying on them to attack one another. So corruption and war came to the Third World as it had to the other. With present-day inflation, theories are the cheapest commodity around, costing less than a penny a gross. It is better to stick with the available facts. Those facts are that one or more civilizations preceded early man and left behind magnificent megaliths as proof of their artistic and engineering abilities. Something destroyed those civilizations, or perhaps they destroyed themselves. Great civilizations have risen and died within the past 2,000 years alone. Our own civilization may be following the same unhappy route, and 2,000 years from now the Earth may again flip over on its axis. Great sheets of ice may bury the rubble of our cities. Silt and stones will wash over our towers and fortresses. And somewhere a handful of beings, reduced to savagery by necessity, will tell tales around their campfires about us and how we even dared to reach for the moon. Thousands of years after that, a new breed of anthropologist will collect those tales and scoff, even though all the tribes from all parts of the planet will have the same tales to tell. It is plainly impossible, those scientists will say, that any super civilization could have existed in prehistoric times. And primitive man could hardly have flown to the moon. It is folly to even listen to such nonsense. It's far more fruitful to measure and study those giant faces carved into Mount Rushmore, faces that are obviously replicas of ancient gods. Probably they were carved by the same primitives who erected that great ring of stones in the British Isles, they will observe sagely. Mankind is like a broken record repeating the same refrain over and over again. Chapter 7. Scientists in Collision. In 1950 a new meteor raced across the horizon, spewing a long trail of crisp ideas that left the scientific establishment sputtering in rage. The meteor was a book dealing with history, astronomy, and archaeology. It was written by a psychiatrist and published by a major Madison Avenue bouse. Science editors and book reviewers across the country greeted it with awe, comparing its author with Galileo, Newton, Darwin, and Einstein. The public responded by making the book a bestseller. It was titled Worlds in Collision and written by Dr. Immanuel Velikovsky. Dr. Velikovsky tore at the delicate underpinnings of modern science, applying excessive scholarship to the problems of how the planets were formed and what forces may have wrought changes in the Earth. Along the way he was obliged to invent new theories based upon the flimsy, by scientific standards, evidence of mythology. He dared to throw out some of science's most coveted concepts, substituting MS own cosmology. The explosion followed almost immediately. The biggest names in astronomy and physics organized and fulminated. They set out to destroy this upstart by flooding his publisher's office with vicious letters threatening to boycott the firm unless Velikovsky's book was withdrawn. Since the publisher also had a profitable sideline of textbooks and was heavily dependent upon the academic community for support, this ugly campaign had some effect. An assistant editor who had first suggested publishing the book was fired, and publication rights were turned over to another publisher who did not have a textbook business. Leading scientists gave public lectures denouncing Velikovsky. The scientific journals were filled with critical anti-Velikovsky letters and articles. It was modern science's darkest hour. There was a response which for intensity and hostility was unequaled in 20th century scientific history, the Los Angeles Times later noted. What triggered this emotional outburst? Velikovsky's main theme was that the planet Venus was really a comet hurled out of the planet Jupiter. It had brushed past the Earth, he said, on its way into orbit around the Sun and had been observed by all the existing races and recorded in the mythology. Immanuel Velikovsky was born June 10, 1895, in Vitebsk, Russia. He studied medicine and law at some of Europe's best universities. He couldn't go to a Russian college because he was a Jew, received his medical degree in 1921, and settled in Palestine in 1924. He knew Freud personally and corresponded with the great man in the last years of his life. In 1939 Velikovsky and his family moved to New York, intending to stay only 8 months. But he was already toying with his theories, and he spent the next 9 years in libraries conducting the exhaustive research which finally resulted in W0RIDS in Collision. Today he lives quietly in Princeton, New Jersey, rarely appearing in public. He has been more fortunate than Wegener in his continental drift theory in that Velikovsky has yet to see his critics silenced and many of his seemingly far-out concepts confirmed. Ever since the invention of the printing press, publishers have been flourishing on best-selling books covering the whole spectrum of pseudoscience. Volumes of profound nonsense, such as the works on pyramidology and Atlantis, have sold in amazing numbers generation after generation. Nearly every major publisher has books of astrology and flying saucers on his lists. A large part of the endless stream of theses, papers, and learned studies by establishment scientists has in time proven invalid and more crackpot than even the cultist literature. It was incredible that Velikovsky's contemporaries singled out his work, a book that had taken 9 years of careful study and research, for their venom. In retrospect, many of the anti-Velikovsky critiques read like the work of deranged lunatics who had not even bothered to read the book they were attempting to criticize. They were against the book simply because it propounded ideas that were contrary to the accepted theories of the day. They resented the fact that a psychiatrist dared to speculate on astronomy and archaeology. He was an intruder. Above all, they resented the fact that his book was very well written. Most scientists are miserable writers. If I had not been psychoanalytically trained, I would have had some harsh words to say to my critics, Dr. Velikovsky said loftily in the early 1950s. Orthodox scientists have always sneered at the works of Charles Fort, an American humorist who published 4 books of oddities and scientific anomalies, primarily because Fort delighted in attacking the scientific establishment. Now they tried to lump Velikovsky together with Fort. Scientists and the untutored followers of scientism spent years denigrating Velikovsky and generating the legend that he was just another crackpot. The aging psychiatrist just ignored them and went on writing books expanding MS' central thesis. In a rare attempt at self-defense, he stated that he hoped that future generations of scientists would understand his work more dearly. He wrote off his contemporary critics, and this prompted Martin Gardner to observe in 1952 that Dr. Velikovsky is an almost perfect textbook example of the pseudoscientist, self-taught in the subjects about which he does most of his speculation, working in total isolation from fellow scientists, motivated by a strong compulsion to defend dogmas held for other than scientific reasons, and with an unshakable conviction in the revolutionary value of his work and the blindness of his critics. One of the favorite points of the anti-Velikovsky critics was that he relied upon ancient myths and traditions for his evidence. Actually, in Worlds in Collision, he devoted many pages to this problem. Since he was trying to reassemble events which transpired in prehistoric times, before the advent of written records, he was obliged to perform a comparative study of early legends. He recognized that the problem of interpreting such material correctly was monumental. Traditions about upheavals and catastrophes, found among all peoples, he wrote, are generally discredited because of the short-sighted belief that no forces could have shaped the world in the past that are not at work also at the present time, a belief that is the very foundation of modern geology and of the theory of evolution. Those were fighting words to the scientific establishment. Velikovsky compounded his felony by suggesting that numerous events and catastrophes long accepted in religious lore as miracles and acts of God were in reality observations of astronomical phenomena which could be explained. This was totally unpalatable to the scientific community and to many others as well. In 1950, the State American Journal of Stents ranted that Velikovsky's book was best described as burlesque of both science and history. 17 years later, Yale Scientific magazine devoted an entire issue to vindicating the good doctor. Among these are Earth in Upheaval, Ages in Chaos, and Oedipus and Akhenaten. Harper's. June 1951. What had happened in those 17 years? For one thing, the old guard had changed to a degree, and many bright young men had emerged, clutching their slide rules as they rode the tails of man-made comets to Venus and Mars. For another, the stupefying and stultifying atmosphere of the McCarthy era of the early 1950s had ended. Professor Lloyd Motz of Columbia University scented the tide of change, and in a letter in Harper's in October 1963, he cautiously admitted, "I do not support Velikovsky's theory, but I do support his right to present his ideas and to have those ideas considered by responsible scholars and scientists as the creation of a serious and dedicated investigator and not the concoctions of a charlatan seeking notoriety." Scientists and professors live in the uncomfortable atmosphere of the academic rule, publish or perish. They grind out interminable research papers and studies, not because they have something to say, but because their livelihood often depends upon their ability to put their names into print. This unfortunate system has spawned an army of men whose academic credentials are sound enough but who indulge in quasi-research. Some even manage to acquire a considerable reputation by publishing a steady stream of unread books. Professor Mote's remark about the concoctions of a charlatan seeking notoriety one is revealing, because scientists are painfully aware of the many charlatans in their own midst who thrive on such notoriety. Over and over again in the past, leaders of the scientific community have proven mere charlatans or, at best, competent organizers and administrators, while their less notorious contemporaries made the real contributions to their field. This spills over of course into other fields such as literary criticism, where a man will write a critical essay of a famous author, and then others will write critical essays of the original critique. Soon the little literary magazines are actually feeding upon themselves, and the professors are quarreling about their interpretations of said famous author. Velikovsky became the most prominent victim of this system. If he had written a book about psychiatry, his own field, or sex, and sold 1 million copies, no one would have cared. But when he invaded the turf of others, presented unpopular ideas in a logical and successful manner, and got the book published, well, he had gone too far. To the scientists of the 1950s, he had to be a charlatan seeking notoriety, like Herr Horbiger of another era. They chanted, "Either you believe in us, or you must be treated as an enemy." A decade later the main dish served at many a scientist's table was crow. Astronomers were dead certain in 1950 that both Jupiter and Venus were elderly planets, and after much peering through their telescopes, they had constructed some fanciful facts about both bodies. These facts were taught, as usual, to generations of school students as the gospel. Assorted studies had proven that the surface temperature of Venus was somewhere between 25 degrees Celsius and 30 degrees Celsius, making it a relatively cool planet and possibly an inhabitable one. Dr. Velikovsky's theory was that Venus was actually an ex-comet and had been in solar orbit for only 34 centuries. If he was right, the surface of Venus would have to be considerably hotter. In 1961, Dr. Frank Drake and other radio astronomers turned their equipment on Venus and discovered that its temperature based upon its radio emissions was at least 600 degrees Fahrenheit, or 315 degrees Celsius. Later, the United States and the Soviet Union sent unmanned space probes to Venus and confirmed that it was a mighty hot place and that there might be some source of surface heat other than solar radiation. Venus is the second planet from the Sun after Mercury. Even the side turned away from the Sun radiates considerable heat. Another interesting discovery was that Venus rotates slowly in a retrograde, that is, clockwise, direction and has movements, which are in sharp contrast to the other planets in the solar system. Maybe Venus was created apart from the other planets, scientists at the Goldstone Tracking Station muttered in 1962, perhaps as a secondary solar explosion or perhaps in a collision of planets. There were other factors, such as the heavy hydrocarbon atmosphere of the planet, which seemed to confirm Dr. Velikovsky's 1950 speculations. Venus is definitely an oddball among the planets, but the astronomers of 1950 didn't know any of this. Turning to the ancient records for his evidence, Dr. Velikovsky pointed out that early peoples had recorded Venus as an exceptionally bright object trailing smoke. The Chinese, Mayas, Toltecs, and Aztecs also recorded its motion, and the early Venus apparently followed a different orbit, or trajectory, than the diminished orb now visible in our skies. The people of Mesopotamia did not even record Venus in their astronomical records. Later the Chaldeans described it as a bright torch of heaven that illuminates like the sun and fills the entire heaven. Other far-flung cultures preserved similar comments, all of which suggest that Venus began as a comet which roared very close to the Earth at one point, close enough perhaps to cause tidal waves and spew burning fragments onto the Earth's surface. Another part of Dr. Velikovsky's evidence consisted of the stories of the rain of fire which encompassed the Earth, and he quoted from Mexican texts as well as the records of the Assyrians. If he was right, then some of the oil deposits on Earth were a result of that celestial shower. But geologists have always assumed that oil is created by a process which takes millions of years. Since Worlds in Collision was written, deposits of liquid hydrocarbons have been found and dated in the Gulf of Mexico and elsewhere, giving every indication they are only a few thousand years old. The ancient texts described the comet Venus as coming from the fifth planet, Jupiter. Was this possible? This was the flimsiest part of the Velikovsky theory, and the most widely attacked. Ironically, the very men who advocate the theory that tektites are the result of meteor impacts on the Moon, Chapter 4, are the same ones who deny that a Jovian comet could come into being, perhaps by the same process. Velikovsky proposed a collision of planets as a possible source. The asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter could be made up of surviving fragments from that awesome event. Our ideas about Jupiter itself have been revised considerably since 1950. We used to think of it as a gigantic planetary body composed of gases and liquids, but in recent years powerful radio waves have been detected coming from it. Apparently, there are great electrical storms on the surface, and some of these storms affect earthly radio waves as much, or more so, than sunspots. Studies of all this have led to a new theory, now quite popular among astronomers, that Jupiter may not be a planet at all. It may be a cold star. Maybe one planet could not give birth to another, but a star, even a cold star, could. Jupiter's diameter is approximately 11 times the diameter of the Earth, about 86,000 miles. As nearly as we can determine, it revolves very rapidly on its axis. A Jovian day is less than 10 Earth hours long. Through the telescope it appears to be ringed with cloud-like bands, the most interesting feature of which is the famous red spot. This is an elliptical spot some 40,000 kilometers long and 13,000 kilometers wide, roughly equal in area to the entire surface of the Earth. This spot was first observed by Robert Hooke in 1664. Astronomers have been watching it ever since. It also rotates with the planet but at different speeds. And it always remains in approximately the same latitude, wandering only slightly. Morris K. Jessup and other ufologists have advanced the notion that the TED spot is actually a great spaceship, a monumental ark from outer space, which transported the survivors of some dying world into our solar system. Some modern flying saucer contacts even claim that the spacemen have taken them to Jupiter and shown them this ark. Other contacts have been told stories about the ark by the spacemen. It is waiting for the day when the Earth will be evacuated by the kindly space people. Then we will all fly to the stars aboard it. Well, not all of us. Just those lucky humans who have been chosen by the space people. Several dry runs have already been held in recent years with the chosen contacts closing down their homes and businesses to sit on a hill or mountaintop and wait for the evacuation to begin. A number of these dry runs are documented in the author's book, UFOs, Operation Trojan Horse. Jupiter's ark is an integral part of modern flying saucer lore. Stanley Kubrick's epic motion picture, 2001, added to this lore by having astronauts head for Jupiter after a mysterious monolith was discovered on the Moon. The monolith, a faceless gray slab, is used throughout the film as the symbol of some extraterrestrial force guiding man's destiny. In the dosing scenes of 2001, scenes which have thoroughly baffled many moviegoers, an astronaut arrives on Jupiter only to enter into a new phase of evolution, a kind of rebirth. Shorn of its cinematic mysticism, the film is a restatement of what many cultists have been saying all along. The flying saucer buffs have been misled by astronomical terminology. Although the red spot is usually termed an object, it could be almost anything. Bernard M. Peake, an amateur astronomer, called it a raft and suggested it could be some form of water floating like an iceberg in the Jovian atmosphere. Professor Raymond Hyde, of the British Meteorological Office, proposed in Scientific American in February 1968 that it could be the visible part of a phenomenon known as a Taylor column, a stagnant cylinder of liquid centered above some depression or topographical feature on the planet below. The late Frank Edwards, a radio news commentator and author of UFO books, poetically equated it with a giant eye always turned towards Earth. Some followers of Velikovsky have asserted that the red spot is really the hole left behind when Venus was catapulted out into space. In order for a body the size of Venus, which is only slightly smaller than the Earth, to be successfully hurtled out of Jupiter, it would have to attain an incredible escape velocity to overcome the great mass and gravity of the planet. Achieving this velocity would require a tremendous amount of energy, or as Professor Motz put it, to eject a planet like Venus, Jupiter would have had to release in a matter of seconds or minutes as much energy as the Sun emits in more than a year. Jupiter would therefore have appeared as bright as a nova, an exploding star, which is about 1,000,000 times as luminous as the Sun. Dr. Velikovsky attempted to explain this by theorizing that a large mass on a near collision course with Saturn and Jupiter may have set the cosmic machinery in motion. Whatever may have happened, Velikovsky's main premise is that Venus is a young planet. He predicted in 1950 that Venus would prove to be hot and that it would display orbital eccentricities. The claims have now been verified. He claimed that the ancient records stand as proof that Venus was not even present in the skies until fairly recent times, that it first appeared as a comet hauling a tail and followed a course somewhat different from its present one. Its passage through our solar system caused massive disturbances on Earth and probably wholesale destruction. There are written records of those disturbances and archaeological and geological evidence of that destruction. In relatively recent times, Venus posed a new mystery. Today's astronomers agree that our sister planet has no moons. But a satellite was observed orbiting Venus in 1672 by a prominent astronomer named Castnell. He saw it again in 1686. Other well-known astronomers, using primitive but adequate instruments, cited it in 1740, 1759, 1764, and 1791. They all noted that it seemed to be about 1/4 the size of Venus itself, giving it a diameter of 2,000 miles, and that it was very bright, almost luminous. It's very hard to lose something 2,000 miles across, even in space. But no astronomer has seen this object since 1791. Flying saucer cultists have taken Venus' vanishing satellite to their bosom, claiming naturally that it was really a gigantic spacecraft, but the object's extreme luminosity could mean that it was a fragment of the Venus comet itself, following a retrograde orbit which eventually sent it into the planet's surface. We have followed a long and bizarre trail from the ancient rumors of massive catastrophes to the Atlantis-bound theories of Donnelly to the Ice Age notions of Horbiger's Way, and finally to the carefully researched and thought-out conclusions of Dr. Immanuel Velikovsky and his still controversial concept of colliding worlds. These men and their many followers were probably mostly wrong, but there is always a chance that they might also be partially right. While their peers and colleagues have fumed, fussed, and fought, ridiculed, and attacked their body syntheses, a new generation of scientists has steadily uncovered substantial scientific evidence which seems to support them. New theorists will undoubtedly seize upon this new evidence and construct concepts which will make them seem pikers. We are beginning to realize that the Earth's crust is in constant motion, that the continents are adrift. The whole planet may flip-flop on its axis every few thousand years, causing water to bury land areas, bringing new land areas to the surface, and thrusting temperate zones into the Arctic cold to be smothered by ice. And if we can accept Velikovsky, our little mud ball is running the constant hazard of encountering objects and forces in space which can wreak unbelievable havoc in hours or days. The moon could even fall on us one day, or the sun could suddenly explode. Our whole technological civilization could be wiped out in a flash. It would not be too surprising, therefore, if other great civilizations might have flourished on this planet many thousands of years ago. Other great races, not necessarily linked to us biologically, could have existed here. The supergiants of Powell's and Bergier could have been real. All that has survived of that ancient race are the puzzling stone monoliths and the great mountains and ridges. It was a logical step for a super-civilization to move from the construction of mountains and earthworks to the building of the more permanent pyramids of Egypt, China, and South America. Their culture, or remnants of it, survived and were imitated by early man. For thousands of years, superb stonemasons labored all over this planet, erecting pyramids, then temples, then great cities. Our sciences have timidly attempted to reconstruct the history of the past 3,000 or 4,000 years, never daring to look beyond. And woe to anyone, such as Velikovsky, who does dare